At my son's wedding, the bride, my new daughter-in-law, sat me in the kitchen, the $500,000 wedding my company provided as a gift. I smiled, stayed quiet, and with a few simple phone calls, I began to dismantle her perfect day. But they didn't know the party wasn't the real gift. The real gift was a $50 million international contract I had arranged for my son in Dubai, a contract and a honeymoon that were about to vanish into thin air. Before I tell you how the silence of a jazz band can be louder than any wedding bells, do me a favor. Let me know in the comments where you are listening to my story from. And if you believe that respect is a debt that must be paid, hit that like and subscribe button. You are going to want to hear this. I arrived at the wedding alone. The venue was magnificent, a historic Atlanta estate with sprawling gardens and a grand ballroom, its tall windows glowing with a warm golden light against the twilight. I should have felt nothing but a pure, uncomplicated pride. After all, I had built this. Not the house itself, of course, but the event. Every perfect blooming rose, every flawlessly folded napkin, every crystal glass that shimmered under the chandeliers was a product of Vance Premier Logistics, my company, my legacy. This whole affair was my wedding gift to my son Marcus, a gift with a price tag that hovered somewhere north of $500,000. A small price I had thought for the happiness of my only child. I stood for a moment just inside the grand entrance, an old man in a tailored tuxedo that still felt as foreign as a borrowed skin. I am a man more comfortable in a work shirt and steel-toed boots than in silk and patent leather. I built my company not in a boardroom, but from the back of a single cargo van in the 1970s, a young black man trying to sell luxury services to a world that didn't think he belonged at the party, let alone planning it. And now I owned the party. I watched the guests, a glittering sea of Atlanta's elite. They were Chloe's people, men with easy smiles and hard eyes who talked about portfolios and property values. Women with diamonds that glittered like ice and laughter that never quite reached their eyes. They were a world away from the one I had come from, a world of dirt-stained hands and honest labor. I felt a familiar pang of being an outsider, a feeling I had thought I had left behind decades ago. Then I saw him, my son. He stood in the center of the room, a glass of champagne in his hand, laughing at something one of his new friends had said. He looked like a king in his tailored tuxedo, his handsome face lit with happiness, and my heart swelled with a foolish fatherly pride that momentarily eclipsed all my other feelings. He was a good man, my Marcus. A little soft, perhaps, a little too eager to please, but a good man. And then I saw her, his new wife, Chloe. She was a vision, a perfect porcelain doll in a cloud of white designer lace. She moved through the crowd with a practiced, easy grace, her smile a brilliant, dazzling thing that she bestowed upon her guests like a queen bestowing favors. But I had been in this business for 50 years. I was a student of smiles, and I knew a real one from a performance. Chloe's smile was a performance. It was a beautiful, flawless, and utterly cold work of art. I had tried to like her for Marcus's sake. I had silenced the small warning voice in my head that told me she saw my son not as a partner, but as a stepping stone. That she saw his inheritance, my life's work, not as a legacy to be cherished, but as an asset to be liquidated. I had told myself I was just a protective, old-fashioned father. Tonight, surrounded by the world she had so carefully curated, a world that she had paid for with my money, I was no longer so sure. I shook off the feeling. Tonight was about Marcus. Tonight was about his happiness. I started to make my way through the crowd, looking for my seat for the place of honor at the family table where the father of the groom was meant to sit. I was ready to play my part to be the proud, benevolent patriarch. I was ready to deliver the speech I had written, a speech about love and legacy and the solid, honest foundations upon which a good life is built. I had no idea that my daughter-in-law had already decided that my part in this play was a silent one, and that my seat was not in the ballroom at all. I made my way through the shimmering, laughing crowd, a slow, steady ship navigating a chaotic sea. I nodded politely to strangers who smiled at me with a vague, polite curiosity. They knew who I was, of course. In this world, the man who pays the bills is always a person of interest. But they looked at me not as the father of the groom, but as a curiosity, a successful black man, from a different, older generation, a living relic of a time before their own. I was a story they might tell their friends later, but I was not one of them. My eyes scanned the grand ballroom for the family table. It wasn't hard to find. It was the largest, most extravagantly decorated table in the room, placed in a position of honor on a slightly raised dais right at the edge of the polished dance floor. It was a beautiful sight, a testament to the skill of my own employees. The centerpiece was a magnificent explosion of white orchids and roses cascading down onto a runner of pure silk. The china was fine bone-edged in gold, and the crystal glasses sparkled like diamonds under the warm golden light of the chandeliers. And at each of the 12 place settings was a small, elegant card, the guest's name written in a beautiful flowing calligraphy. I approached the table with a quiet sense of anticipation, the first uncomplicated feeling of fatherly pride I had felt all evening. This was my table, my family, the culmination of my life's work. I expected to see my name, Elias Vance, written on the card at the head of the table, the traditional place for the patriarch. Or perhaps next to Marcus, a seat of honor beside my son on the most important day of his life. I began to circle the table, my eyes scanning the elegant script on the small white cards. I saw the names of Chloe's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Albright, placed in the seats of honor. That was to be expected. I saw the name of her brother and his wife. I saw the name of an aunt and an uncle from her side of the family. And then I saw my son's name, Marcus Vance, and beside him the card that read, simply, the bride. I continued my circuit of the table, but my name was not there. I stopped. I stood there for a moment, a small, cold knot of confusion beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. It must be a mistake, a simple, embarrassing oversight. In an event of this size with hundreds of guests, these things happen. My own company, Vance Premier Logistics, was in charge of the seating arrangements, but Chloe and her mother had made several last-minute changes. My name must have simply been left off the list by accident. I took a step back from the table, my eyes scanning the room for one of my event coordinators, someone I could quietly pull aside to fix this small, awkward error. I was not angry. I was not even hurt. I was just confused and a little embarrassed. To have paid for this entire magnificent affair only to have been forgotten in the seating chart was a peculiar kind of irony. I looked over at my son. He and Chloe were holding court, the happy center of their own glittering universe. They were laughing, accepting congratulations, their faces glowing with a picture-perfect joy. I couldn't bring myself to interrupt them. I couldn't walk over to my son on his wedding day and point out this clumsy, awkward mistake. I would not cast that small shadow over his happiness. I would wait. I would find the planner. It was, I told myself, nothing, a simple logistical error. But as I stood there, a man without a place at his own family's table, the small knot of confusion began to tighten. It began to feel less like an oversight and more like a statement. I looked at the 12 chairs at the 12 perfectly placed settings, and I realized there was no empty seat. There was no space where a forgotten card might have gone. The table was perfectly and completely full. It was a closed circle, and I was on the outside of it. I told myself I was being foolish. I was a 75-year-old man, tired and out of place, letting his imagination get the better of him. It was a mistake. It had to be. And then I saw her, one of my junior event planners, a young, capable woman named Maria, hurrying towards me, her face a mask of professional panic. And in her eyes I saw the truth. This was no mistake. Maria, one of my junior event planners, hurried towards me through the crowd. She was a good kid, sharp, organized, and always impeccably professional. But the woman approaching me now was not the calm, capable planner I knew. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a kind of professional terror. She was clutching her clipboard to her chest like a shield, and her smile was a brittle, painted-on thing that didn't come close to masking the sheer panic in her eyes. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice a low, nervous tremor. "I was just coming to find you. We have your seat all ready for you." "Good," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. I couldn't seem to find my name at the family table. I assumed there was a small mix-up with the place cards. Maria's smile flickered and died. She couldn't meet my eyes. She looked down at her clipboard at the floor at a point somewhere over my shoulder. Yes," she stammered. "Well, there's been a slight adjustment to the seating plan. A special request from the bride, Mr. Vance. She wanted you to have a more intimate setting." Intimate. The word was a lie, and we both knew it. There is nothing intimate about a wedding with 200 guests. The cold knot of confusion in my stomach began to tighten, to harden into something that felt a lot like dread. "A special request," I repeated, my voice quiet. I see. Well, lead the way, Maria. Show me to this intimate setting. She gave a small jerky nod and turned. I followed her. We did not walk towards the dais, towards the place of honor. We walked in the opposite direction towards the back of the grand ballroom, away from the music, away from the laughter, away from the light. We walked past the guest tables, past the gift table, past the towering, magnificent wedding cake that my own bakery division had spent a week creating. We walked until we reached the discreet swinging service doors that led to the kitchen, the doors my uniformed staff had been moving in and out of all evening. And there, tucked into a small, dark alcove right beside the bustling, chaotic entrance to the kitchen, was my seat. It was not a grand, orchid-draped table. It was a small, wobbly card table, the kind you might find in a church basement, hastily covered with a single, mismatched linen cloth. There was one chair, one place setting, a cheap paper napkin instead of the fine linen the other guests had. It was a table for one, an afterthought, a place for someone who was meant to be heard but not seen. Maria would not look at me. Her face was a mask of pure professional shame. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice cracking. She insisted. I just nodded slowly. I understood. This was not her fault. She was just a soldier following a cruel and deeply insulting order. "It's all right, Maria," I said, my voice gentle. "You can go." She gave me one last apologetic look and then practically fled, disappearing back into the warmth and the light of the party. I stood there for a long moment, looking at my table, my intimate setting. The swinging doors beside me burst open and a waiter hurried out a tray of empty glasses balanced on his shoulder. For a split second, the door stayed open and I was hit with a blast of noise and heat from the kitchen, the clang of pots, the hiss of the grill, the shouted orders of the head chef. Then the door swung shut, and I was in the dim, quiet alcove again. The door swung open the other way, and I could hear the music from the ballroom, the sound of laughter, the murmur of happy conversation. I was not in the kitchen. I was not in the ballroom. I was in a place that was neither. I was in purgatory. I slowly pulled out the single lonely chair, and I sat down. And in the quiet, humiliating darkness, the truth finally settled on me, a weight as heavy and as cold as a gravestone. This was not an oversight. This was not a mistake. This was a message, a deliberate, calculated, and breathtakingly cruel act of public humiliation. My new daughter-in-law, a woman whose entire perfect day I had paid for, had taken me, the patriarch of the family, the founder of the company that was the source of all her newfound wealth, and she had hidden me away like a dirty secret. She had sat me with the staff, and the humiliation was a fire, and it was beginning to forge something new inside me, something hard and cold and unbreakable. I sat down. The chair wobbled slightly on the uneven floor, a small pathetic instability that seemed to mirror my own. The initial stunning shock of my placement was beginning to recede, and in its place a cold, sharp, and deeply painful clarity was beginning to set in. This was not a mistake. Maria's terrified eyes had told me that. This was a deliberate, calculated act, a strategic placement. I was a problem that had been solved, an inconvenient piece of the past that had been neatly tucked away. From my lonely outpost, I was a citizen of two worlds and a member of neither. To my left, the service doors swung open and shut with a frantic, percussive rhythm, each swing delivering a blast of heat, the clatter of plates, the shouted, urgent language of the chefs. It was the sound of labor, the engine room of the grand party, a world I understood in my bones. To my right, through the alcove, I could see a slice of the ballroom. I could see the shimmering dresses, hear the muffled thump of the music, the bright tinkling sound of champagne glasses, and insincere laughter. It was the world I had paid for, the world I had built for my son, and I was not welcome in it. I sat there, my hands resting on my knees, a statue of quiet dignity I did not feel. I tried to understand. I tried to find a reason, an explanation that was not rooted in a cruelty so profound it was almost unthinkable. I told myself that perhaps Chloe was simply embarrassed. Embarrassed by me, by my simple, unpolished ways, by my hands which were clean now but still bore the permanent ingrained memory of a lifetime of hard work. Perhaps in her world, a world of inherited wealth and effortless grace, a father-in-law who had started his empire with a single cargo van was a story to be told, but not a person to be seen. And then I looked for my son. I scanned the sliver of the ballroom. I could see my eyes searching for Marcus. I found him. He was standing near the head table talking to one of Chloe's relatives, a tall, silver-haired man with the easy, arrogant posture of old money. Marcus was laughing, his head thrown back, a picture of perfect, uncomplicated joy. He looked happy. He looked like he belonged. A foolish, fatherly hope, a last desperate ember of denial flickered in my chest. He doesn't know, I told myself. He has no idea. He's been so caught up in the whirlwind of his own wedding he hasn't even noticed. He would be horrified if he knew. He would come and he would fix this. And then, as if summoned by my own desperate thoughts, he turned. His eyes full of laughter and champagne swept across the room. And then they found me. Our gazes locked across the crowded ballroom, a direct, undeniable line of sight between the place of honor and the place of shame. I saw the laughter die in his eyes. I saw a flicker of something else take its place. Shock, guilt, pity. I don't know. His smile faltered. The world seemed to stop for a single terrible heartbeat. This was the moment. The moment for him to frown, to excuse himself, to stride across the room and demand to know why his own father was sitting by the kitchen door. The moment for him to be the man I had raised him to be. He did not frown. He did not move. He did the worst thing of all, the only thing in that moment that was truly unforgivable. He looked away. It was not a casual glance. It was a quick, furtive, and deeply ashamed movement of his eyes. He looked away from me as if I were a beggar on the street, a source of unbearable public embarrassment. And then he turned his body just slightly, angling himself away from the alcove, away from me, and he took a sip of his champagne and he laughed again, a sound that was a little too loud, a little too forced. The ember of hope in my chest didn't just flicker and die. It was extinguished, drowned in a sudden, ice-cold flood of betrayal. The humiliation of the table, the cruelty of my new daughter-in-law, that was one thing. That was an attack from an enemy. But this was a wound from my own flesh and blood. This was the silent, cowardly betrayal of a son who had just witnessed his father's public humiliation and had chosen to do nothing. He had chosen his new wife, his new life, his new status over his own father. The pain of it was a deeper, colder violence than any physical blow could ever be. I sat there in my lonely, ridiculous chair, and I finally understood. I was completely and utterly on my own. And in the cold, hard forge of that terrible final knowledge, something new was beginning to take shape inside me. A father's soft, forgiving heart was being burned away, and in its place, something else, something as hard and as sharp as steel, was beginning to form. The clinking of a fork against a champagne glass, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the low murmur of the ballroom. A respectful silence fell as Chloe, my new daughter-in-law, rose from her seat at the head table. She was a vision of perfection. The light from the chandeliers caught in the diamonds of her earrings and in the shimmering silk of her dress. She held her glass with a delicate, practiced grace, her smile a brilliant, dazzling thing that she bestowed upon the room. "I just want to say a few words," she began, her voice a smooth, confident melody that carried easily through the silent room. "First, to my wonderful parents, thank you. Thank you for giving me the world and for teaching me to never settle for anything less than I deserve." The words were sweet, but I heard the steel beneath them. Never settle. She then thanked the guests for coming, for sharing in what she called the most important day of our new lives. And then she turned to my son. She placed a delicate hand on his shoulder, and the look she gave him was a masterful performance of adoration. "And to my husband," she said, her voice dropping to a more intimate, emotional tone. "Marcus, you have given me a future I could only have dreamed of, and I promise you together we are going to build something truly extraordinary." I sat in my dark corner, an unseen ghost at the feast, and I watched. My heart, which had been a cold, heavy stone in my chest ever since Marcus had looked away from me, felt a fresh, sharp pang of pain. He was her future, and I, it seemed, was his past. "A wedding," Chloe continued, turning her brilliant smile back to the crowd, "is about new beginnings. It's about two people coming together to create their own story, their own legacy." She raised her glass. "It's about having the courage to build a future that is truly ours, unbound by the traditions, the expectations, or the burdens of the past." As she spoke that last line, "burdens of the past," her eyes for a fraction of a second flicked away from the adoring crowd. They moved with a quick, deliberate precision across the room, past the guest tables, and they found me. They locked with mine for a single chilling heartbeat. And then I saw it. A small, almost imperceptible smirk, a flicker of pure triumphant malice touched the corner of her perfect red lips. And in that instant everything became clear. The knot of pain and confusion in my gut was gone, burned away by the cold, clean fire of pure, unadulterated certainty. This was not a mistake. This was not an oversight. This was a coup, a carefully planned and ruthlessly executed public dethronement. My son's cowardly silence was not an act of weakness. It was an act of complicity. He had not just allowed this to happen. He had been a part of it. They had decided together that the old man, the founder, the source of all their wealth, was a liability, an embarrassment, a burden of the past that needed to be neatly and quietly discarded. And my son's wedding was to be my public funeral. The pain was gone now. The heart of the father, the soft, forgiving part of me that had been bleeding out in this dark corner, was gone. And in its place, something else, something old and familiar, something I had not felt in years, was beginning to stir. It was the mind of the CEO, the cold, calculating and deeply strategic mind of the man who had built an empire from nothing, the man who had faced down bankers and racists and competitors and had never ever lost a fight that mattered. I had retired that man. I had put him to sleep believing his work was done. But my daughter-in-law, with her cruel, triumphant smirk, had just woken him up. The room erupted in applause for her beautiful, heartfelt speech. The guests raised their glasses, their faces full of a sentimental warmth. They were applauding the birth of a new family. They had no idea they were actually applauding the declaration of a new war. I sat there in my lonely chair by the kitchen door, and for the first time that night I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a general who has just seen the enemy make a fatal and deeply arrogant miscalculation. The party, my party, was just getting started. The warm, golden light of the ballroom might as well have been a world away. Here in my shadowed alcove, the light was a harsh, intermittent blue-white, a cold glare that spilled out every time the kitchen doors swung open. The sounds were a battle. From my right, the muted, elegant strains of the string quartet, the polite murmur of 100 conversations. From my left, the raw, unfiltered sounds of labor, the angry hiss of a hot grill, the percussive crash of a dropped metal tray, the sharp-barked orders of the head chef. More sea bass on table 12. Get me 2 more bottles of the Chardonnay now. I sat there a king in exile, and I listened to the sounds of the engine that drove my empire. And in the clatter of those plates, I was transported back 50 years to a different kind of noise. To the rattling, protesting groan of my first and only asset, a used 1972 Ford Econoline van. The words Vance Logistics were painted on the side, a job I had done myself with a stencil and a can of white spray paint. It wasn't premier, it wasn't luxury, it was just me, a young black man with a strong back and a desperate burning hunger to build something that was my own. I remembered the early days, the 16-hour days that started before dawn loading folding chairs for a church picnic and ended long after midnight hauling away the trash from a college fraternity party. I remembered the taste of cold coffee and the permanent ache in my lower back. I remember my wife Rose, my beautiful, brilliant Rose, sitting at our small kitchen table, a single lamp burning, going over the books, her brow furrowed in concentration, stretching every single dollar until it screamed. We were a team. She was the brains and the heart. I was the back and the will. I remembered the doors that had been closed to me, the white bankers who had looked at my business plan and smiled, their eyes full of a polite, dismissive pity. It's a fine idea, Elias, one of them had told me, but the high-end event market, it's a relationship business, and you don't have the right relationships. I knew what he meant. I was the wrong color. I had the wrong background. I was a ghost at their party then, too. So I built my own relationships. I did the jobs no one else wanted. I was more reliable, more meticulous, more dedicated than any of my white competitors. I built my reputation, one flawless, back-breaking event at a time. And I did it all for one reason. I did it for the son who was currently on the other side of that wall, laughing, drinking champagne, and pretending not to see me. I had endured the quiet condescension, the subtle racism, the years of struggle so that he never would have to. I built this empire, this $500,000 wedding, this entire world of effortless luxury so that he could walk into any room, any bank, any party, and be seen not as a black man, but just as a man. So he would have the right relationships. And so his wife, his beautiful, ambitious white wife, would see him as her equal. I looked through the alcove at the head table. I saw Chloe whisper something in my son's ear, and he laughed, his face full of an uncomplicated adoration. Her words from her toast echoed in my ears, unbound by the burdens of the past. And in the harsh, clattering reality of my seat by the kitchen, I finally, and with a clarity that was as sharp and as painful as a shard of broken glass, understood. I was the burden, my past, my struggle, the story of the man who had built all of this with his own two dirt-stained hands. That was the story she wanted erased. She didn't want a father-in-law. She wanted an inheritance stripped of all its inconvenient and unfashionable history. The pain in my chest was a physical thing now, a crushing weight. The father in me, the soft, foolish, loving part, was dying. He was dying a slow, lonely death in a wobbly chair by a noisy kitchen door. But as he died, something else, something I had thought was long since retired, began to stir. It was the founder, the fighter, the man who had faced down a world of polite, smiling no's and had built an empire out of sheer, stubborn will. And he was not a sentimental man. He was a man who understood one thing very, very well. A bill is a bill, and a debt must always be paid. I looked at the beautiful, perfect party I had created, and I began quietly and with a cold, clear, and terrible precision to calculate the cost. For a long time, I just sat there. I watched the party I had paid for ebb and flow like a glittering, mindless tide. I watched my waiters carry trays of champagne that my company had purchased. I listened to the string quartet, my string quartet play music that I had selected. I was the ghost in my own machine, the invisible hand that had created this entire perfect world, and I had been banished to the shadows. The father in me was a hollowed-out ruin. But the CEO, the man who had built an empire on the simple principle that every action has a consequence and every service has a price, was wide awake, and he was coldly, calmly, and methodically calculating the bill. My son and his new wife had made a critical business error. They had mistaken a gift for a given. They had failed to show respect to their primary investor, their sole benefactor. And in the world I had built in the cold, hard logic of profit and loss, such an error had consequences. I did not storm out. I did not raise my voice. I did not go to the head table and flip it over, though a primitive, wounded part of my soul screamed for me to do just that. No, that would be their game. A messy, emotional family drama. My game was different. It was a game of logistics, of contracts, of cause and effect. It was a game they had no idea how to play. I waited for the opportune moment when the speeches were over and the guests were lost in the haze of dinner and conversation. Then with a quiet deliberation, I pushed my wobbly chair back, stood up, and began to walk. I did not walk into the ballroom. I walked the other way through a service corridor that smelled of starched linen and floor wax, a path that was invisible to the guests but as familiar to me as my own home. I emerged into a quiet, manicured garden at the side of the estate, the cool night air a welcome shock after the stifling heat of the kitchen. The music from the ballroom was a faint, muffled thump out here. The only light was the distant glow from the ballroom windows and the cold, impartial light of the moon. I took out my phone, a simple, old-fashioned flip phone that was a testament to my belief in function over form. I pressed a single number on my speed dial. It rang twice. "Diane," a calm, professional voice answered. There was no hello. There was no Vance Logistics, just her name. She had been my operations manager, my right hand, my most loyal general for 30 years. "Diane," I said, my own voice a low, quiet thing in the darkness. "It's me." There was a pause on her end, a beat of profound, listening silence. She knew my voice. She knew my moods. And she knew with an instinct born of 3 decades of shared battles that this was not a social call. "Yes, Elias," she said. "What do you need?" I looked back at the glowing tent. "Are you watching the live feed from the event?" I asked. "Of course," she said. "The string quartet seems to be a little off-key tonight." It was her way of telling me she had seen it all. She had seen my seat by the kitchen. She had seen my son's betrayal. "It's time, Diane," I said, my voice cold and steady. "We're moving to Plan B." I heard a sharp intake of breath on her end, and then a sound that was as beautiful to me in that moment as any symphony. It was the sound of a quiet and deeply satisfied, understood. Plan B was not a formal document. It was a verbal contingency plan that Evelyn had insisted I put in place with Diane months ago, a doomsday protocol I had prayed I would never have to activate. It was a plan to systematically and with surgical precision dismantle a $500,000 event in real time, using the very contracts and infrastructure that had built it. First, I said the band. The jazz ensemble is scheduled to start their set at 9 o'clock after dinner. I want you to call their agent. Inform them that due to a last-minute scheduling conflict, their services will no longer be required tonight. And Diane, I added, make sure you invoke Clause 12B of their contract, the one regarding client-side cancellations due to unforeseen circumstances. It will ensure they are paid in full for their time. This is not about the money, it's about the silence. Consider it done, she said, her voice a blade of pure, efficient steel. The band is canceled. What's next? I took a breath. The first move had been made. That's all for now, I said. I'll call you back in 30 minutes with the next phase. I hung up the phone. I stood there for a moment in the cool, quiet darkness. I had just pulled the first thread, and I knew that by the end of the night, the entire beautiful, expensive tapestry my son and his wife had wrapped themselves in would be nothing but a pile of expensive, useless string. I turned and walked back inside, back to my lonely table by the kitchen door, a quiet old man who had just set a fire and who was now simply waiting with a profound and terrible patience to watch it burn. I returned to my table. No one had noticed I was gone. To the glittering world in the ballroom, I was a non-entity, a ghost they had already forgotten. To the frantic world in the kitchen, I was just a strange old man sitting in a dark corner. I was invisible. And in my invisibility, I found my power. I sat down, my back straight, and I waited. I was a spider in the center of a vast, intricate web, a web that I myself had built, and I had just plucked the first silent thread. Now I simply had to wait for the vibrations to return to me. I had a perfect, if fragmented, view of the main bar. It was a magnificent creation, a long, polished mahogany bar my company had installed just for this evening, stocked with the kind of single malt scotches and small batch vodkas that men like Chloe's father liked to talk about. And he was there holding court, a large, florid man with a booming laugh. He had a glass of what looked like a very expensive whiskey in his hand, and he was gesturing with it expansively, a king in his temporary castle. He was basking in the reflected glory of my wealth, accepting the compliments of his friends on the magnificent generosity of his new extended family, my family. He had not spoken a single word to me all evening, not one. He and his wife had swept past me when they arrived, their eyes sliding over me as if I were a piece of furniture, a part of the hired help. And now he was drinking my whiskey in a ballroom I had paid for, celebrating a marriage that was founded on the quiet public humiliation of my son's father. The injustice of it was a cold, hard knot in my gut. I waited another 15 minutes by the clock on my phone, long enough for the instruction to be relayed, long enough for the new reality to take hold. The father in me was a ruin, but the CEO was a master of timing. Then I took out my phone again. I did not go outside this time. There was no need for secrecy anymore. The first move had been made. The rest was just a matter of logistics. I pressed the same number on my speed dial. Diane answered on the first ring. "Yes, Elias," she said. There was no question in her voice, only a quiet waiting readiness. "Diane," I said, my voice a low, even murmur that was easily swallowed by the noise from the kitchen. "Phase 2. "Understood," she said. "The premium open bar," I said. "It is now closed. Instruct the bar manager to switch to a cash-only basis for all top-shelf liquor, effective immediately. The house wine and domestic beer can remain complimentary for now. Let's not be inhospitable." A small cold smile touched my lips. "The good stuff, however, now has a price." "Consider it done," she said, and I could hear the fierce, joyful satisfaction in her voice. "The bar menu is being updated as we speak. What's next?" "The flowers," I said. "But not yet. I'll call you back." I hung up. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I folded my hands on the wobbly table in front of me, and I watched. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The party continued, a beautiful, oblivious machine. And then I saw it. The first ripple. One of Chloe's father's friends, a man with a face as red as his expensive-looking tie, went up to the bar and ordered another round of the same dark, expensive scotch they had all been drinking. The bartender, a young man I had trained myself, said something to him, his expression a mask of polite professional regret. The man's jovial face clouded over with confusion. He said something back, his voice a low, angry grumble I couldn't hear. The bartender just shrugged apologetically and pointed to a small new sign that had been discreetly placed at the end of the bar. The man leaned in to read it. He stood up straight, his face a mask of pure indignant shock. He turned and stormed back to Chloe's father, his hands empty. I watched as he explained the situation. I saw Chloe's father's face go from benevolent host to furious guest in the space of a heartbeat. I saw him stand up, his chest puffed out, and march towards the bar, ready to do battle. And I saw the bar manager, a man who had worked for me for 15 years, a man whose loyalty was not to the client of the night, but to the man who signed his paycheck every 2 weeks, meet him there, with a calm, unshakable, and deeply apologetic firmness. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the result. Chloe's father, his face now a shade of purple. I had previously only seen on eggplants. Reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and threw a credit card on the bar. The wave had just hit the shore. And it was even more beautiful than I had imagined. The aftermath of the confrontation at the bar was a low, simmering fire. Chloe's father, having been forced to pay for his own 25-year-old scotch, had returned to his table, his face a thundercloud of impotent fury. He was a man who was not used to being denied anything, and the small public humiliation was a wound to his pride. Chloe and Marcus had rushed to his side, their own faces masks of strained apology and frantic damage control. From my vantage point, I watched the performance of it all, the soothing hands on the arm, the whispered promises to get to the bottom of this. They were trying to put out a small fire with no idea that the entire forest was about to burn down. The dinner service concluded. The last of the dessert plates were cleared away by my efficient and now very nervous staff. The string quartet, which had provided the elegant if slightly soulless soundtrack for the meal, played their final polite notes and took a bow to a smattering of applause. A quiet fell over the ballroom, but it was a pleasant, expectant quiet. The quiet of a full stomach and a warm, alcohol-induced haze. It was the moment of transition, the moment when a formal dinner party sheds its skin and becomes a real celebration. The guests began to turn their chairs away from the tables, their eyes drifting towards the polished, empty dance floor and the small, elevated stage at the far end of the room. They were ready for the music. They were ready to dance. And then nothing happened. The silence, which had been a comfortable pause, stretched. It went from a pleasant, expectant void to an awkward, questioning one. The stage where a lively 8-piece jazz ensemble was supposed to be setting up remained empty. The string quartet, having finished their set, began to quietly pack away their instruments, their movements efficient and final. They were done for the night. The guests began to look around, their brows furrowed in mild confusion. A low murmur, a quiet ripple of questioning began to spread through the room. "Where's the band?" I heard a woman at a nearby table whisper. "I thought Chloe said they had that amazing group from the city." I looked over at the head table. Chloe's perfect, dazzling smile was still in place, but it had become a brittle, painted-on thing. Her eyes, which had been so full of triumphant malice just an hour before, were now darting nervously towards the empty stage. She was a general whose reinforcements had failed to arrive. I saw her lean over and whisper something sharp and urgent in my son's ear. Marcus, who had been trying to placate her father, now had a new fire to put out. He pulled out his phone, his face a mask of frantic professional concern. I watched him tap at the screen, a useless, desperate attempt to contact a band manager who I knew had been instructed by Diane to turn off his phone for the evening. An event, a party of this magnitude, is a living organism. It requires a constant flow of energy, of food, of drink, of music to keep its heart beating. The guests are not just there to attend, they are there to be carried along on a current of seamless, effortless joy. And that current is a product of logistics, of timing, of 1,000 different invisible threads all being pulled in perfect harmony. They had made the fatal mistake of believing that the party was theirs. They had forgotten that I was the one pulling the threads. And now I was simply letting them go one by one. The silence in the room was no longer just an absence of music. It had become a presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that was smothering the celebratory mood. The low murmur of conversation grew louder, tinged with an edge of disappointment and boredom. The perfect magical evening was beginning to fray at the edges. I saw Maria, my young event planner, speaking frantically into her headset, her face pale with a stress that was far beyond her pay grade. The party was beginning to die. and I was its quiet, invisible, and deeply satisfied executioner. They had wanted me to be silent. They had wanted me to be invisible. So I had given them a silence they could all share. A silence that was louder and more eloquent than any speech I could ever have given. The silence in the ballroom was a beautiful, terrible thing. It was a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed the uncomfortable sounds of a party dying, the scrape of a chair on the polished floor, a forced, too loud cough, the low, anxious murmur of 200 people who had been promised a celebration and were instead being served a plate of awkward, unexplained silence. The empty stage was no longer just a space waiting to be filled. It had become a monument to a promise broken. I watched my son Marcus from my dark corner. He was a man in a state of controlled panic. He was on his phone, his back to the room, his shoulders tense. He was pacing back and forth, a caged animal in a tailored tuxedo. I knew who he was calling. He was calling the band manager, the florist, the caterer, the lighting designer. He was calling every number on the master schedule that my company had so carefully prepared for him, and he was getting no answers. He was a captain on a ship where the entire crew had suddenly and silently mutinied. And that is when the cold, hard, and deeply satisfying truth of my life's work settled on me, not as a memory of struggle, but as a present and powerful weapon. Marcus was making a fundamental mistake. He was operating under the illusion that he was the client. He thought that because this was his wedding, he was in charge. He had forgotten, or perhaps had never bothered to learn the first and most important rule of the empire I had built. The vendors do not work for the client. They work for me. Vance Premier Logistics was not a party planning company. It was a closed ecosystem, a fortress. Over 50 years, I had not just hired florists and bakers and musicians. I had cultivated them. I had built them. I remembered Isabella, the woman whose magnificent floral arrangements were currently gracing the guest tables. When I first met her, she was a young woman with a small flower stall in a farmer's market, her hands full of a talent that was bigger than her small business. I saw her gift. I didn't just hire her for a few events. I gave her an exclusive contract. I co-signed a loan for her first real shop. I connected her with growers and suppliers. I invested in her, I made her success a part of my success, and I had done the same for the jazz band, for the caterer, for the lighting company, for every single vendor whose name was on that schedule. They were not just contractors, they were partners. Their loyalty was not to the bride and groom of the week, a fleeting temporary source of income. Their loyalty was to Vance Premier Logistics, the institution, the man who had given them millions of dollars in consistent, reliable business over the course of decades. Their contracts, their mortgages, the college educations of their children were all built on the foundation of their relationship with my company, with me. So when my son in his frantic panic called the band manager did not see the name Marcus Vance on his caller ID. He saw a temporary client who was associated with a man who could ruin his entire business with a single phone call. And he knew whose call to answer. He was not ignoring Marcus's calls. He was following my orders, relayed silently and efficiently through Diane. He was respecting the true chain of command. Chloe and Marcus had made the fatal mistake of all people who inherit power without understanding its source. They thought the throne was the power. They didn't understand that the real power was in the vast, invisible network of loyalty and obligation that holds the throne up. They thought they were the kings of this party. They were merely its temporary and now powerless tenants. I watched my son finally give up his shoulders, slumping in defeat. He walked back to Chloe, his face a mask of bewildered failure. I saw him shake his head. I saw her perfect smiling mask crack a flicker of pure, unadulterated fury in her eyes. The silence was beginning to rot the heart of her perfect day. And I was just getting started. The music had died. Now it was time for the beauty to wither. I took out my phone. I pressed the same number. Diane answered on the first ring. "The flowers, Diane," I said, my voice a quiet, calm command. "All of them. Cancel the rest of the evening's arrangements. And I believe it's time to close the open bar completely. Not just the top shelf. Everything." "Consider it done, Elias," she said, and the web trembled again. The dead, awkward air in the ballroom was a testament to my son's incompetence. I watched him from my alcove, a general observing a lieutenant who has failed his first real test. He was failing spectacularly. He was running from one frantic conversation to another, his face pale, a faint, panicked sheen of sweat on his brow. He was a man trying to start a car with no engine, and he couldn't understand why it wouldn't turn over. He was looking for a quick fix, a technical solution to a problem that was not technical at all. The problem was one of loyalty, of respect, of power, and he had none. In that moment, watching him flail and fail, the last vestiges of my anger towards him dissolved, replaced by something far colder and far more profound, a deep, soul-crushing disappointment. And with it a terrible clarity. The fault I knew was partly my own. The weakness I was seeing in him now, the weakness that allowed his wife to lead him by the nose, was a weakness that I myself had cultivated. I had loved him too much, and I had protected him too well. My own life had been a constant, brutal fight for every inch of ground. I had wanted his to be different. I had wanted him to have the ease, the confidence, the unquestioned place in the world that I had spent my life earning. And so I had made him soft. I had given him the fruits of my labor without ever forcing him to understand the labor itself. I remembered when he was 25, fresh out of business school with a head full of theories and a heart full of ambition. I could have made him start at the bottom the way I had. I could have put him in a cargo van, made him work the loading docks, made him understand the sweat and the logistics that were the real foundation of our glittering empire. But I hadn't. I had given him the corner office. I had handed him the keys to our biggest account, a multi-million-dollar annual contract with a major corporation. I had wanted him to feel the thrill of success, to taste power, to become the leader I knew he could be. And he had succeeded on paper. He had managed the account well. But I saw the signs even then. He didn't celebrate the long hours or the flawless execution of his team. He celebrated the perks. He celebrated the expensive dinners with the client charged to the company account. He celebrated the new top-of-the-line German sports car he bought himself, a car he said was necessary to project the right image. And he saw the business not as a living, breathing thing to be nurtured, but as a machine that produced a certain kind of lifestyle. He had inherited the throne, but he had no interest in the kingdom. I tried to tell him once. I sat him down in my office and I told him the story of the first van. I told him about the racism, the 16-hour days, the quiet, desperate fear of failure that had been my constant companion for a decade. He listened, his face a mask of polite, patient respect. He nodded in all the right places, but his eyes were distant. He was listening to a story about a past that had nothing to do with him. He saw my struggle as a quaint historical anecdote, not as the living, breathing foundation upon which his entire comfortable life was built. And now I was seeing the result of my failure as a father. I had raised a son who saw my legacy as an entitlement, not a responsibility. And because he felt no responsibility for it, he felt no need to defend it, or to defend its founder. His silence at my humiliation was not an act of malice. It was an act of pure, unthinking indifference. He did not defend me because in his mind there was nothing to defend. I was just the old king, the past, and he was the future. He had no idea that the future he was so eagerly embracing was about to be canceled due to a simple and catastrophic failure of leadership. His. The dead air in the ballroom was a reflection of the dead space in my own heart, where my pride in my son used to be. I watched him, a frantic, useless ghost at his own party, and the disappointment was a cold physical weight. And as I watched him fail, I finally allowed myself to see the truth not just about him, but about the woman who had so expertly and completely remade him in her own image. The poison had been administered in slow, careful doses, so sweet and so subtle, I had convinced myself it was just a new kind of nourishment. I remembered a dinner at their new, painfully modern house about a year ago. It was a place of white walls, sharp angles, and furniture that looked like it was designed to be admired, not lived in. Chloe had been talking about the company, my company, with the bright, enthusiastic tone of a young executive with a fresh perspective. "Elias," she had said, her voice a melody of helpful suggestion. "Have you ever thought about rebranding Vance Premier Logistics? It's a wonderful legacy brand, of course, so classic. But for the new market, for the international clients Marcus is courting, we need something with a little more edge, something that doesn't feel so family-owned." I had smiled politely. I had explained to her that our name, the Vance name, was our brand, that it was a symbol of reliability, of a personal promise that I had spent 50 years building. She had just smiled back, her eyes full of a sweet, pitying condescension. "Of course," she had said. "I completely understand the sentiment." Sentiment. She had called my life's work my family's name a sentiment, a quaint, old-fashioned feeling that was getting in the way of progress. I had dismissed it then as the harmless, ambitious chatter of a young woman who didn't understand. I see now it was the first shot in her campaign to erase me. The next shot had come a few months later after I had secured the largest contract in our company's history, a massive multi-year logistics deal for a new tech campus. I had been proud not just of the money, but of the fact that our company, my company, was still a major player. I had expected them to celebrate the victory with me. Instead, Chloe's eyes had lit up with a different kind of fire. "This is it," she had said, her voice a low, excited hum. "This is our exit strategy." I had just stared at her. "Exit strategy, Chloe. This is a 5-year contract. This is a new beginning." "Exactly," she had said, her smile brilliant. "Our valuation will never be higher. This is the perfect time to sell. A major international conglomerate would buy us in a heartbeat. Marcus could take a golden parachute we could cash out, and he could finally be free to do something of his own without being tied to all of this." All of this. She had looked around my office at the pictures of my first van at the awards I had won, at the framed photos of Rose and a young Marcus, and she had called it all of this, a collection of inconvenient old things that were standing in the way of her payday. But the final and most venomous dose of poison was the one I had not been meant to hear. It was a warm evening last summer. I had stopped by their house unannounced to drop off a birthday gift for my grandson. They were on their back patio, a cold, sterile space of concrete and stainless steel. They didn't see me. I heard her voice, a soft, seductive whisper in the twilight. "You're trapped, baby," she was saying to my son. "Don't you see it? This legacy isn't a gift. It's a burden. It's a set of golden shackles. You're living in your father's shadow, running his company, living his dream. You could be so much more if you were just free of it." I had stood there in the darkness, my heart turning to ice. She was not just trying to sell my company. She was trying to sell my son a new version of his own life, a life where his father's love was a cage and his inheritance was a prison. And he, my son, my weak, foolish son, had listened. He had let her words sink into his soul and rot him from the inside out. He was not just her husband. He was her first and most successful acquisition. And I was just the final inconvenient clause in the contract, a liability to be managed and then discarded. The silence in the ballroom had grown teeth. It was no longer a simple absence of music. It was an active, malevolent presence. The initial confusion of the guests had curdled into a palpable sense of boredom and disappointment. The polite murmur of conversation had been replaced by the rustle of expensive fabrics as bored guests shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking towards the exits. A wedding reception is a delicate ecosystem, and I had just cut off its primary food source, entertainment. I watched Chloe. Her perfect porcelain smile was now a desperate, brittle rictus. She was moving from table to table, her laughter a little too loud, her apologies for the technical difficulties with the band a little too shrill. She was a captain on a sinking ship, frantically trying to bail out the ocean with a teacup. My son trailed in her wake, his own face a mask of anxious apology, a loyal but useless first mate. They were focused on the music, on the silence. They had no idea I was about to attack on a new front, the visual front, because I knew Chloe. I knew her better than my own son did. She was a creature of aesthetics, of the perfect picture. The substantive details of the business, the logistics, the numbers, those things bored her. But the look, the feel, the sheer breathtaking beauty of an event, that was her language. She didn't care if the foundation was rotten as long as the facade was breathtaking. And the second half of the evening's facade was meant to be Isabella's masterpiece. Isabella, my florist, the woman whose small market stall I had transformed into the most sought-after floral design studio in Atlanta. Her contract for tonight's wedding was a work of art in itself. It was designed in 2 phases. Phase 1 was the elegant classic white roses and orchids that currently graced the tables. Beautiful but safe. Phase 2, which was scheduled to be installed during the lull after dinner, was the spectacle. It was Isabella's signature midnight bloom reveal. Cascading walls of deep purple and blue orchids that were meant to be unveiled around the dance floor. Magnificent ice sculptures internally lit and filled with exotic flowers were to be placed by the dessert tables. It was the wow factor, the part of the evening that was designed to be photographed, to be posted on social media, to be the talk of Atlanta for months. It was Chloe's crowning moment of aesthetic triumph, and it was never going to happen. I looked at my phone. It was time. I stood up and took another quiet walk into the side garden, a ghost leaving the scene of a crime he was still in the middle of committing. The night air was cool and clean. I pressed the same number on my speed dial. Diane answered with a single crisp word. "Diane?" "Phase 3, Elias," she asked. There was no surprise in her voice, only the cool, calm readiness of a loyal soldier. "The flowers, Diane," I said. "All of them. Cancel Phase 2. Isabella's team should be in the staging area now. Tell them there has been a significant change of plans. Tell them to pack up their materials and go home." "All of them?" she asked, and I could hear the hint of a smile in her voice. "The ice sculptures, too." "Especially the ice sculptures," I said. "Invoke Clause 7D, full payment plus a 20% bonus for the inconvenience. This is not about punishing our partners, Diane. This is about delivering a message to our clients." "A very clear message," she said, her voice full of a quiet, fierce satisfaction. "Consider the garden dismantled." I hung up the phone. I stood there for a moment looking at the distant glittering lights of the city. I had just canceled a display of beauty that had cost over $50,000. It felt like nothing. It was a lesson, a masterclass in consequences. You cannot have a beautiful house if you disrespect the man who laid the foundation. You cannot have a beautiful party if you relegate the man who created it to the shadows. They had wanted to erase the past, the burden of my history, so I would erase the future of their perfect evening. The magic was gone, and in its place was just a room, a collection of expensive and increasingly uncomfortable chairs. The party was now a beautiful dying flower, its petals beginning to curl and brown at the edges. And the final act was yet to come. The chaos at the bar was a beautiful, terrible thing to watch. Chloe's father, a man I now knew was named Richard Albright, was holding court, not with the jovial backslapping confidence of before, but with the sputtering, red-faced indignation of a man whose divine right had been challenged. He was a man, I realized, who had spent his entire life gliding through the world on a current of assumed privilege. He had never been told no at an open bar in his life, and the experience was a profound and deeply personal affront. Chloe and Marcus were in full damage control mode. They were a frantic, whispering whirlwind of apologies and reassurances. I watched them move from guest to guest, their faces plastered with strained, brilliant smiles. I could almost hear the lies they were spinning. "A small mix-up with the venue's account," I imagined them saying. "A temporary glitch in the system." They were trying to frame this as a clumsy, embarrassing mistake on the part of the venue, with no idea that the venue was simply following the quiet, firm instructions of the man they had hidden by the kitchen door. But the problem was metastasizing. The initial shock of a few guests was now spreading through the room like a contagion. The top-shelf liquor, the currency of status and celebration in this world, had been cut off. The whispers started to ripple outwards from the bar, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere from celebration to complaint. The technical glitch excuse was beginning to wear thin. More and more guests were approaching the bar, only to be met with the same polite professional refusal from my staff. The party was beginning to bifurcate into two distinct classes, those content with the house wine and those who were deeply personally offended that their favorite 18-year-old scotch now came with a price tag. The situation was becoming untenable. The murmur of discontent was growing louder, threatening to drown out the strained music of the string quartet. Chloe, her face a mask of barely controlled panic, was now in a heated, whispered argument with the bar manager. And I knew the moment had come. The moment of public clarification. The moment when a quiet, logistical decision would become a public, humiliating fact. The young wedding planner, Maria, the same girl who had led me to my lonely table, stepped onto the now empty stage. She looked terrified. Her hands were trembling as she held the microphone. She tapped it once, twice, the sound a nervous, hollow pop that echoed in the tense room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "May I have your attention, please?" A hush fell over the ballroom. All eyes turned to the stage. They were expecting an announcement that the band had finally arrived, that the party was about to begin. Instead, they were about to receive an obituary. "On behalf of the Vance family and our hosts," Maria said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth, "I was sure we'd like to thank you all for celebrating with us tonight. We have a small logistical announcement regarding the bar service." She took a shaky breath. Due to some unforeseen and unavoidable vendor complications, the complimentary premium bar service for the evening has been concluded. House wine and domestic beer will of course remain available for your enjoyment. All other beverages will be available on a cash basis. We apologize for any inconvenience. The words so calm and so professional were a bomb. I watched Richard Albright's face, the man who had been loudly boasting about the generosity of the Vance family, who had been basking in the reflected glory of my wealth, had just been publicly and spectacularly neutered. He had been revealed to be a guest at a party whose host had just cut off his credit. His face went from red to a deep mottled purple. His wife, who was sitting beside him, looked as if she had been slapped. The mask of horrified embarrassment on her face was a thing of terrible beauty. And Chloe. She stood by the stage frozen as the whispers erupted all around her. The architect of this perfect evening was now a prisoner within its collapsing walls. She had wanted to create a night of flawless, effortless luxury, and I had just reminded her and all of her guests that nothing is effortless. Everything has a price. And respect, I thought to myself as I sat in the shadows, is a debt that must always be paid. The party was not yet dead. It was merely wounded. It was time to take away its beauty. The party was a beautiful corpse. The guests were the awkward, unwilling mourners at a funeral they didn't understand. They stood in small, quiet clusters, speaking in the low, hushed tones of people who know something has gone terribly wrong but are too polite to say so. The silence where a jazz band was supposed to be was a gaping wound. The half-empty glasses of house wine were a testament to a celebration that had run out of fuel. And my son and his new wife were the frantic, failing morticians trying to apply makeup to a body that was already cold. I watched them from my alcove, a quiet observer of the beautiful, expensive, and deeply satisfying disaster I had set in motion. They thought this $500,000 spectacle was the prize. They thought that by humiliating me, by casting me into the shadows, they had successfully claimed their inheritance. They were fools. They were children fighting over a beautifully wrapped but ultimately empty box. They had no idea what the real gift was. They had no idea what they were truly losing. The wedding, the party, this entire extravagant affair that was not my gift to them. That was a stage. A beautifully set and ridiculously expensive stage for the real gift. The real gift was not here in this room full of fading flowers and awkward silences. The real gift was waiting for them 7,000 miles away in a glass tower that scraped the sky in the middle of the Dubai desert. For 6 months, I had worked in secret, leveraging a lifetime of relationships and a reputation for flawless execution to build a bridge to my son's future. I had secured a meeting. Not just a meeting, an opportunity. A $50 million logistics contract with Sheikh Al Jamil, one of the most powerful and respected developers in the Middle East. It was a legacy contract, the kind of deal that would not just enrich our company, but would elevate it to a truly global stage. And I had arranged for Marcus to be the one to close it. Their honeymoon was a lie. A beautiful, elaborate, and deeply loving lie. The first-class tickets to Dubai, the presidential suite at the Burj Al Arab that was booked in their name, it was all part of the stagecraft. It was all designed to place my son, my heir, in the right room at the right time with the right people. He was not going there as a tourist, he was going there as the future of Vance Premier Logistics. He was going to walk into that meeting, a meeting I had spent my own political and financial capital to secure, and he was going to emerge a king in his own right, a man who had secured a $50 million contract on his own merits. That was my gift to him. Not a party, not a check, but a chance. A chance to step out of my shadow, to prove to himself and to his new ambitious wife that he was more than just his father's son. It was to be his coronation, the moment he truly inherited the kingdom, not by birth, but by conquest, and he had thrown it all away. For what? For the sake of his wife's petty, pathetic social climbing. For the sake of her embarrassment at having a father-in-law who had built his empire with his own 2 hands. He had stood by in cowardly silence while I was treated like a servant in the house that I had built for him. He had failed the first and most important test of leadership. He had failed to show respect to the foundation upon which he stood. A king who cannot command the respect of his own father is not a king at all. He is a pretender. And I could not hand over my empire to a pretender. The silence in the ballroom was no longer just a consequence. It was a judgment, and I was not finished delivering my verdict. I looked at the beautiful dying party. It was time for the final act, the grand finale that would never happen. I took out my phone. The screen cast a cool blue light on my face in the darkness. I pressed the same familiar number. Diane answered, her voice ablade. "Yes, Elias." "The fireworks, Diane," I said. "And the late-night food trucks. Cancel them both. The party is over." The party had become a ghost of itself. The initial awkward silence had been replaced by a low, persistent murmur of discontent. The guests were no longer celebrating. They were enduring. They stood in small, unhappy clusters, their half-empty glasses of house wine held like props in a play they were desperate to leave. The magnificent ballroom, which had been designed to be a theater of joy, had become a beautifully decorated waiting room. Chloe was a frantic, smiling ghost herself. She was a whirlwind of strained apologies and brittle laughter, a performer trying to hold the attention of an audience that had already walked out. I watched her, a general observing a failing campaign, and I felt a cold, clinical detachment. She was the architect of this hollow cathedral, and she was now frantically trying to pray in it with no idea that God had already left the building. But the worst part of the evening, the grand finale of her perfect empty spectacle, was yet to come. Or rather, it was yet to not come. I knew Chloe's playbook. I had, after all, written it. The end of the night was not meant to be a quiet fizzle. It was designed to be a crescendo. At 11 o'clock, the guests were to be ushered out into the gardens for a surprise, a grand, thundering exclamation point on the evening, a 10-minute professionally choreographed fireworks display set to music. After the fireworks, a fleet of Atlanta's trendiest gourmet food trucks, tacos, sliders, artisanal donuts were scheduled to arrive, a final decadent parting gift to send the guests home full and dazzled and deeply impressed. It was the final act of the performance, the part that would guarantee that this wedding, her wedding, would be the most talked-about social event of the year. It was the part that was all about the show, all about the appearance of effortless, boundless wealth. It was the part that was most important to her, and it was the part that was about to vanish into thin air. I thought about the real gift, the $50 million contract waiting in Dubai, the honeymoon suite that was in reality a boardroom in disguise, the future of my son's career, a future I had so carefully and so lovingly built for him. He had traded it all for this, for a night of fireworks and fancy tacos, for the approval of these shallow, whispering people. He had traded a kingdom for a circus, and the circus was about to be canceled. I looked at my phone. It was 10:45. It was time. For the last time that night, I took out my phone. I didn't need to go outside. The party was so subdued, my small corner so quiet that no one would have heard a gunshot. I pressed the single button on my speed dial. Diane answered before the first ring had even finished, her voice ablade. "Yes, Elias." The time for phases was over. It was time for the simple final command. "Diane." I said, my voice a quiet, calm, and utterly final thing. "The grand finale. Cancel it." "The fireworks and the food trucks?" she asked, and I could hear the fierce, joyful smile in her voice. "Both," I confirmed. "Contact the pyrotechnics team. Tell them the event has concluded early. Contact the food truck coordinator. Tell them their services are no longer required. Invoke the cancellation clauses. Pay them whatever they ask. I want them paid in full, and I want them gone before they ever get here." "Consider them ghosts," she said. "The party is over, Elias." "Yes, Diane," I said. "It is." I hung up the phone. I slipped it back into my pocket. I had not just killed a party. I had performed a mercy killing. I had put a dying, miserable creature out of its misery. I looked across the room at my son and his wife. They were standing by the large windows looking out at the gardens, their faces full of a desperate, anxious hope, waiting for the first rocket to streak across the sky. They were waiting for the magic to restart, for the show to go on. They had no idea that the show was over. The theater was closing, the lights were about to go out, and they were about to be left alone in the darkness they had created for themselves. The bill had been presented, and now it was about to be paid in full. He finally hunted me down. The party was in its death throes, the guests now beginning to make their excuses and slip away into the night. And in his desperation, my son finally did what he should have done hours ago. He came to find his father. The kitchen doors swung open with a violent shove, and there he was, his face pale and slick with a fine sheen of sweat, his perfectly tailored tuxedo looking rumpled and defeated. He looked not like a groom, but like a man who had just run a marathon in the wrong direction. "Dad," he said. and his voice was a ragged, breathless thing, a sound torn between accusation and a desperate childish plea. "What is going on? What is happening?" I did not stand up. I remained seated at my small, wobbly table, a king on a cardboard throne. I looked at him, my face a mask of calm, polite confusion. "Going on, son?" I asked, my voice quiet and even. "It's a wedding, a beautiful party, though I must say the service has been a little disorganized this evening." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He was not prepared for this. He was expecting a confrontation, a confession, an argument. He was not prepared for me to play the part of a confused, disappointed guest. "The band never showed up," I continued, my voice taking on a tone of mild concern. "And there seems to have been some sort of issue at the bar. And the floral arrangements for the second half of the evening appear to have been misplaced. As the man paying for it all, Marcus, you should probably have a word with the event coordinator. It's a rather embarrassing lapse in service." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of my calm seemed to short-circuit his brain. "A lapse in service," he sputtered, his voice rising in disbelief. "Dad, don't play dumb with me. I know you did this. You're the only one who could. Why? Why would you do this? Why would you ruin my wedding?" And there it was, the accusation, the heart of the matter. I looked at him, my son, this stranger in a tuxedo, and I felt a profound and deeply weary sadness. He was asking me why I had ruined his wedding. He was not asking why his wife had humiliated his father. He was not asking why he himself had stood by and done nothing. In his mind, he and his bride were the innocent victims, and I was the villain. "Ruin it, Marcus," I said, and my voice was as soft as silk. "I would never dream of ruining it. I am simply following your wife's instructions." He looked at me, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending confusion. "Chloe's instructions. What are you talking about?" "Well," I said, gesturing to my small table, to the swinging doors, to the clatter and heat of the kitchen just beyond. "The bride made it very clear where she wanted me. She did not want me at the family table. She did not want me with the guests. She gave me this specific, shall we say, out-of-the-way seat. A place where I would not be a distraction. A place where I would be unobtrusive." I let the word hang in the air between us. I was to be unseen, unheard, a part of the background, a ghost at the feast. I understood her message perfectly. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "So I have spent my evening being exactly that, unobtrusive. I have stayed in my designated area. And from this vantage point, I have simply observed. And I have taken my cues from the leadership. And the leadership," I said, my eyes locking with his, "has made it very clear that the standards of the Vance family, standards of respect, of loyalty, of basic human decency, are no longer in effect at this event. So as the primary vendor, I have simply adjusted the level of service to match the new lower standards set by the client." He just stared at me, speechless. He was trying to find a flaw in my logic, a crack in the cold, hard, and perfectly constructed wall of my reasoning. But he couldn't. I had weaponized his wife's own cruelty, her own disrespect, and I had turned it into a contractual obligation. I had taken her insult and made it my official operating procedure. "Now, if you'll excuse me," I said, picking up my water glass, "this has been a very long evening, and I believe the staff is about to have their end-of-night briefing. I wouldn't want to be in the way." My son stood there, a defeated general in the ruins of his own celebration, when a new storm broke. The kitchen doors didn't just swing open. They were thrown open, crashing against their stoppers with a violent bang. And through them stormed Chloe. She was no longer the perfect smiling bride. The mask was gone. Her face was a thundercloud of pure, undiluted rage, her beautiful features twisted into an ugly snarl. Her eyes, which had been so full of calculated charm, were now blazing with a furious, entitled fire. She was not a victim. She was a fury. "You," she hissed, and the word was a dart of pure venom. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me. "What do you think you are doing? You are ruining everything. Everything." Her voice was a shrill, piercing thing, a sound that made the chefs in the kitchen behind her stop what they were doing and turn to stare. The entire engine room of the party had just gone silent to watch the queen have a meltdown. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I looked at her, this beautiful, terrible creature, and I gave her a small, polite, and deeply infuriating smile. "My dear," I said, my voice as calm and as gentle as a summer breeze, "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. I have been sitting here at the table you so thoughtfully arranged for me, being as unobtrusive as possible, just as you requested." My politeness was a lit match to her gasoline. "Unobtrusive!" she shrieked, taking a step closer, her voice rising with each word. "The band is gone. The bar is a disaster. My father looks like he's about to have a heart attack. My guests are bored. My perfect wedding is turning into a complete and utter joke, and you are sitting here smiling." "I am smiling," I said, my voice still perfectly level, "because despite the small logistical hiccups, I am so pleased to see my son looking so happy. At the end of the day, isn't that what this is all about?" I glanced at Marcus, who was standing behind her, a pale, silent ghost, his eyes pleading with me to stop. But I was not speaking to him. I was speaking to her. "Don't you talk about your son," she spat. "This isn't about him. This is about you. You are doing this deliberately. You are sabotaging my wedding because you are a bitter, jealous old man." The accusation, so raw and so ugly, hung in the hot air between the kitchen and the ballroom. The waiters who had been rushing in and out now stood still, their trays of empty glasses forgotten in their hands. They were my employees. They were her jury. I just shook my head slowly, a look of profound and completely feigned sadness on my face. "Chloe," I said, and I let my voice fill with a fatherly disappointment that was a masterpiece of performance. "I think you are overwrought. It is a stressful day, I know, but to accuse me of such a thing, it's deeply hurtful." I leaned forward as if to share a secret. "I am merely a guest here, a vendor even, one might say, and like all the other vendors, I am simply following the instructions and the tone set by the hosts. And the tone, my dear, has been one of informality, of a certain lack of respect for the old ways. I have simply instructed my teams to adapt to that new, more casual standard." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, speechless. I had taken her insult, her act of profound disrespect, and I had redefined it as a new company policy for the evening. I had made her the author of her own misery. "You are not a vendor," she finally managed to choke out, her voice a strangled whisper. "You are the father of the groom." "Am I asked, my voice full of a gentle, questioning innocence. I gestured again to my small, lonely table. From where I'm sitting, it's a little hard to tell. The final quiet blow landed. She had no response. She had no argument. She had been so thoroughly, so completely, and so politely dismantled that there was nothing left for her to do. Her rage, having found no purchase on the smooth, unyielding wall of my calm, turned inward and consumed her. A raw, frustrated scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure, impotent fury. She spun around and stormed back into the ballroom, a beautiful, perfect bride who had just been revealed to be a screaming, ugly child. And I was left in the quiet with my audience of chefs and waiters who were all looking at me with a newfound and deeply satisfying respect. The sound of Chloe's furious, defeated retreat echoed in the hot, clattering space between the kitchen and the ballroom. For a moment there was a stunned silence. The chefs, the waiters, my employees all stood frozen, their eyes wide, having just witnessed a scene of raw, unfiltered drama that was far more compelling than any wedding reception. Then slowly, as if by some unspoken signal, they all turned their eyes to me, and in their gaze I saw not pity, but a deep and deeply satisfying respect. I was no longer just the owner, the boss. I was one of them, a man who had been disrespected and who had quietly and with unshakable dignity stood his ground. The head chef, a large, intimidating man I had known for 20 years, caught my eye and gave me a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of pure, uncomplicated solidarity. It was worth more to me than all the champagne in that ballroom. Then the silence was broken. "Dad." It was Marcus. He stood in the doorway, a ghost in a tuxedo, his face a pale, haunted mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. He was a man whose entire world was crumbling around him, and he had finally, in his last desperate moment, come to the architect of his own ruin for help. "Dad," he pleaded again, his voice a ragged whisper. "You have to fix this. Please. You have to make a speech." I looked at him, my son, and I felt a profound and deeply weary pity. "A speech, Marcus?" I asked, my voice quiet. "I don't think that's a good idea." It is. He insisted, taking a step towards me, his hands outstretched in a gesture of desperate supplication. It's the only idea left. You have to go up there, say a few words. About family, about love, about new beginnings. You have to make it seem like this is all normal. Please, Dad, people are leaving. Chloe is... She's a mess. You're the only one who can fix this. Fix this. He wanted me to fix this. He wanted me to walk out into that room, to stand on that stage, and to spin a beautiful, heartfelt lie that would cover the ugly, naked truth of their betrayal. He wanted me to be the good old forgiving father, the one who smooths everything over for the sake of family peace. He was asking me to repair the very cage they had tried to put me in. I shook my head slowly, a look of polite and completely feigned regret on my face. Son, I said, my voice full of a gentle paternal reason, I want you to think about what you're asking. I gestured around me at my small wobbly table, at the swinging doors, at the clatter and the heat of the kitchen. Your wife, the bride, has made her wishes for my role tonight very, very clear. This is my place, here, in the shadows, with the staff. I paused, letting the words hang in the air between us. From my position here, Marcus, I said, and my voice was as soft as silk. I don't think my voice could possibly carry all the way to the guest tables. I wouldn't want to shout. It would be disruptive. The logic of it, the polite, unassailable, and deeply cruel truth of it seemed to stun him into silence. He just stared at me, his mind unable to find a counter-argument. We'll move you, he finally burst out, a desperate, frantic solution. Right now, I'll get you a seat at the head table, right next to me. And there it was. The offer that had been withheld for hours was now being made, not out of respect, not out of love, but out of pure, selfish desperation. He didn't want my presence. He wanted my performance. I just shook my head again, a small, sad smile on my lips. Oh no, son, I said, my voice full of a quiet, fatherly horror at the very suggestion. We couldn't possibly do that. Think of the commotion. Think of the disrespect it would show to the bride. She went to so much trouble to arrange this special, intimate seating for me. For me to make a fuss now to demand to be moved in front of all your remaining guests. That would be the height of bad manners. And I would never, ever want to disrespect the bride on her wedding day. I had him. He was trapped utterly and completely in a perfect, beautiful cage of his own wife's making. He could not argue that I should disrespect the bride. He could not argue with my quiet and deeply reasonable refusal. He had no moves left. He just stood there in the service corridor of his own wedding, a groom who had just been rendered completely and humiliatingly powerless. And I, the old forgotten father, just sat in the shadows, took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, and waited for the next part of his perfect evening to fall apart. The air in the ballroom was thick with the ghosts of a party that had died. The guests who remained were no longer guests. They were survivors, huddled together at their tables, speaking in the low, hushed tones of people at a wake. The silence, which had been a weapon, was now just a sad, empty space. The grand, beautiful room my company had so perfectly designed had become a mausoleum for my son's marriage before it had even truly begun. And then it was time for the next act in the tragicomedy, the cutting of the cake. A small round table was wheeled to the center of the dance floor, and upon it was the cake. It was the one piece of the evening's original magnificent plan that I had allowed to survive. It was a masterpiece, a towering 7-tiered creation of architectural genius from my company's own patisserie. It was adorned with intricate handcrafted sugar flowers that cascaded down its sides, a perfect edible echo of the real flowers that had never arrived. It was a monument to the generosity I had intended, a $500,000 wedding condensed into a single breathtakingly beautiful object. And now it was a tombstone. Chloe and Marcus were summoned to the center of the room. They walked as if through a bad dream, their feet dragging on the polished floor. They stood before the magnificent cake, a knife with a silk ribbon tied to its handle in their hands. The photographer, a man whose contract I also held, stepped forward, his camera, a merciless, intrusive eye. "Smile," he said, his voice a forced, cheerful sound that was obscene in the funereal quiet of the room. And they tried. Oh, how they tried. They plastered on the brilliant, dead smiles of people in a hostage video. Chloe's hand, trembling slightly, was placed over my son's. Together they pushed the knife into the soft, perfect icing of the bottom tier. The photographer's flash was a brutal, interrogating light illuminating their strained, miserable faces. They cut a single perfect slice, they placed it on a fine china plate, and then came the most intimate and, in this moment, the most excruciating part of the ritual: the feeding of the cake. Marcus took a small piece on a silver fork. He lifted it to Chloe's lips. Her smile was a rictus of pure, unadulterated misery as she opened her mouth and accepted the bite. Then it was her turn. She lifted a piece to his lips. He ate it, his eyes as empty and as dead as a winter sky. They were performing a ritual of shared joy and a sweet future, but their faces were a portrait of shared and deeply bitter regret. I watched them from my alcove. I had let them have the cake for a reason. Canceling it would have been a simple logistical act of cruelty. But allowing it to be there in all its magnificent, expensive, and now utterly pointless glory was a far more profound and a far more satisfying punishment. It was a symbol, a towering, seven-tiered, sugar-laced monument to what they had lost. It was the physical embodiment of the perfect, beautiful, and effortless life I had offered them, a life they had deemed not good enough, a life they had thrown away because the man who had built it was an embarrassment to them. The cake, I knew, was delicious. My pastry chef was the best in the city, but I knew that to them in that moment it tasted of ash. It was the bitter taste of their own greed, the cloying sweetness of a future that had just been canceled. They had wanted to have their cake and eat it too, and now they were, and it was choking them. The guests offered a weak, pathetic smattering of applause. The ritual was complete, and the wedding, the beautiful, perfect wedding, was well and truly dead. The grand ballroom had become a mausoleum of a party, a beautiful, expensive, and deeply silent tomb. The guests, those who remained, were ghosts drifting in small, awkward circles, their conversations reduced to hushed, uncomfortable whispers. The air was thick, not with celebration, but with the cloying scent of failure. And in the center of this beautiful ruin stood my son and his new wife, the frantic, powerless monarchs of a kingdom that had already fallen. And then I saw him. The one guest in this entire room, aside from myself, who truly mattered. He stood near the now barren dessert table, a figure of quiet, understated elegance in a world of loud, ostentatious wealth. Sheikh Al-Jamil. He was a man in his late 60s with a neatly trimmed gray beard and eyes that held the calm, quiet wisdom of a man who has built cities in the desert. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored dark suit, not the traditional robes he wore in his own country, a gesture of respect for our customs. His presence in this room was a quiet testament to a 50-year career, a testament to the Vance name. He was not one of Chloe's friends. He was not one of Marcus's contacts. He was mine. He had flown here from Dubai, a 17-hour flight, not because he was interested in a wedding, but as a gesture of profound old-world respect for me, Elias Vance, before the signing of a contract that would shape the future of both our companies. He stood alone, observing the slow, awkward death of the party with a look of detached, analytical curiosity. He was a man of substance, not of show, and I could see in his eyes that he was not impressed by the shallow, glittering performance this evening was supposed to have been. And then Chloe and Marcus saw him. They saw him not as a guest, but as a lifeline, a last desperate chance to salvage something from the wreckage of their perfect evening. I watched as they descended upon him, their faces plastered with brilliant, desperate smiles. "Sheikh Al-Jamil," Chloe said, her voice a melody of pure, honeyed charm. "It is such an incredible honor to have you here." He gave her a small, polite, and completely non-committal bow of his head. "The honor is mine, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice a low, cultured baritone. "My congratulations on your marriage." Marcus, desperate to regain some semblance of control, tried to steer the conversation towards business. "Sir," he began, his voice a little too eager, "I am so looking forward to our meeting in Dubai next week. I have some new projections for the port logistics contract that I think you will find very exciting." "Indeed," the sheikh said, his eyes revealing nothing. He took a small sip of his water. He did not engage. He did not ask questions. He was a stone wall, and they were throwing themselves against him, their charm and their ambition shattering into useless pieces. And then his eyes, which had been politely focused on the desperate couple in front of him, lifted. They scanned the room over their heads with a quiet, searching intelligence. And then his eyes found me. He saw me sitting in my dark alcove at my small, wobbly table by the swinging kitchen doors. His polite diplomatic mask did not slip, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a flash of pure, unadulterated understanding. He was a man from a culture where elders are revered, where the patriarch of a family is a king. He had flown 7,000 miles as a gesture of respect to a king, and he had just found that king sitting with the servants. The disrespect was not just to me, it was to him. He understood in that single, silent glance the entire ugly story of the evening. I met his gaze. I did not smile. I did not look away. I simply gave him the smallest, most imperceptible of nods. A quiet acknowledgement between two old lions. A silent message that said, yes, you see it. Now you understand the kind of people you are dealing with. He held my gaze for a moment longer, and then he turned back to my son and his wife, his face still a mask of perfect, inscrutable politeness. "It has been a memorable evening," he said, the words a masterpiece of diplomatic cruelty. "But I am afraid I have an early flight. You must excuse me." He gave them another small, formal bow, turned and began to walk towards the exit. He did not wait for their sputtered goodbyes. He did not look back. He simply left. He was a man of substance, and he had just walked out of a room that had none. And as he left, he took the last glittering hope of their $50 million future with him. I watched him go, and I knew my own work here was done. It was time for me to leave too. The departure of Sheikh Al-Jamil was not a dramatic event. There were no shouts, no grand pronouncements. It was a quiet surgical removal of the last remaining pillar of legitimacy from the hollowed-out structure of the evening. His exit was a silent final verdict, and it left a vacuum in the room that even the most oblivious guest could feel. I watched as my son and his wife, who had been clinging to the hope of the Sheikh's presence, like shipwreck survivors to a piece of driftwood, seemed to visibly deflate. Their last and most important audience member had just walked out of their disastrous play. His exit was my cue. My work inside this brightly lit tomb was finished. I had been the silent witness, the ghost at the feast, the invisible hand guiding the demolition. But the most important part of my plan, the part that would transform this evening from a mere family disaster into a catastrophic business failure, had to happen outside these walls. My physical presence was no longer required. In fact, it was a liability. It was time for the ghost to disappear. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I did not need to. No one save for my son and his wife, who were too lost in their own private hell to notice even knew I was there. I did not walk back through the ballroom. I turned and slipped back into the service corridor, the hidden artery of the event, a world I knew better than my own living room. I walked past the staging areas where the magnificent floral displays still sat wrapped in plastic, a silent, beautiful testament to a party that would never be. I walked past the loading bay where the jazz band's equipment had been unloaded, and then an hour later, loaded up again. I emerged not at the grand main entrance where the remaining guests were now beginning a slow, awkward exodus, but in a quiet secondary lobby near the valet stand. And there he was, Sheikh Al-Jamil, standing alone, a figure of profound, unshakable calm, waiting for his car. I approached him quietly. "Sheikh Al-Jamil," I said, my voice a low murmur. "A word, if I may." He turned, and his face, which had been a mask of polite diplomacy inside, softened with a look of genuine and deeply sorrowful respect for me. "Elias," he said, and the use of my first name was a message in itself. "I must offer my most profound apologies." I said, my voice firm and clear, "for the lack of decorum you were forced to witness this evening. It was a failure of hospitality for which I, as the head of my family, take full responsibility." He held up a hand, a gesture that was both a dismissal of my apology and an acceptance of its sincerity. "My friend," he said, his voice a low, cultured baritone, "a celebration is not a building, it is a foundation, and the foundation is family. The respect a son shows his father, that is the cornerstone." He paused, his dark, intelligent eyes holding mine. "We build empires on trust, Elias. And trust, I have found, begins at home." It was not a cancellation of our deal. It was a reaffirmation of the values upon which that deal was supposed to have been built. He was telling me in the old language of honor and respect that he could not and would not do business with a man who lacked a foundation. A black car, long and silent as a shadow, pulled up to the curb. His driver got out and opened the door. "I understand completely," I said. "I will be in touch with your office tomorrow to formally address this." He gave me a single, slow nod. It was a nod of understanding of shared values between two old lions who had built their worlds on something more than just money. "I have no doubt you will, Elias," he said. He got into the car, the door closed with a soft, expensive thud, and he was gone. I stood there for a moment in the cool night air. I did not go back inside. There was nothing left for me in there. I turned and walked away from the light, away from the sad, dying music, and I headed towards the dark part of the parking lot where my old truck was waiting. I looked back once at the glowing white tent. It looked like a beautiful, expensive ship that had run aground, its lights still blazing, but its voyage over. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I felt only a cold, clean, and necessary sense of finality. It was time for the final and most devastating phase of the demolition. It was time to make the last phone call. The engine of my old Ford rumbled to life, a low, familiar, and deeply honest sound in the quiet of the parking lot. I did not look back at the glowing white tent. To look back would be to acknowledge that it still had some hold on me, and its hold was broken. The man who had walked into that party, a proud and hopeful father, was gone. The man driving away was a CEO, a founder, a king returning to his own kingdom to restore order. I pulled out onto the dark county road, the headlights cutting a steady, unwavering path through the darkness. Sheikh Al-Jamil's final words echoed in my mind, a quiet, powerful affirmation of a truth I had known my whole life. "We build empires on trust, Elias, and trust, I have found, begins at home." My son, in his blind ambition and his cowardly silence, had not just failed to show me respect. He had demonstrated to a man like the Sheikh that the future leadership of my company, his own leadership, was built on a foundation of sand. He had proven himself untrustworthy, and in my world, in the world of $50 million handshakes and legacies that span generations, that is the only sin that can never be forgiven. This was no longer a family matter. It had become a matter of brand integrity. My name, the Vance name, was not just a collection of letters on the side of a truck. It was a promise. A promise of excellence, of reliability, and of an old-world integrity that was the most valuable asset I owned. I had spent 50 years building that promise, and I would not allow my own son, my soft, foolish, and deeply disappointing son, to burn it all down in a single disgraceful generation. My decision was not made in the heat of anger. The fire had burned out, leaving behind the cold, hard, and deeply clear logic of a necessary business decision. This was not an act of revenge. It was an act of quality control. It was a course correction. It was a necessary amputation to save the body of my life's work. I picked up my phone. The glow from the small screen was a cool blue light in the dark cab of the truck. I pressed the single button on my speed dial. Diane answered, her voice a calm, quiet blade in the night. "Elias." She was waiting for this call. "Diane," I said, my voice as steady as the road ahead. "The final phase." "I'm ready," she said. "The Dubai trip," I said, and the words themselves felt heavy, a future being unwritten. "Cancel it, all of it." I could almost hear her nod on the other end of the line. "The first-class tickets for Marcus and Chloe Hayes, the reservation for the presidential suite at the Burj Al Arab, all booked through the company account. I can have them all canceled within the next 5 minutes," she confirmed. "Do it," I said. "But that is the secondary part of the task. The most important part is the communication." I took a breath. "I want you to draft a formal letter on my personal letterhead to Sheikh Al-Jamil's office. It is to be an apology, a profound and sincere apology for wasting his valuable time." "And the reason?" Diane asked, though I knew she already understood. "The reason," I said, and my voice was as cold and as final as a winter morning, "is that due to a recent and deeply troubling internal review, the designated future leadership of Vance Premier Logistics has been found to not currently meet the rigorous standards of integrity, character, and professionalism required to represent our brand on the global stage. Explain that out of respect for the Sheikh and his organization, we must therefore indefinitely postpone any further discussions regarding the port logistics contract until such a time as we have rectified these internal leadership issues." The silence on the other end of the line was a sound of pure, unadulterated, and deeply loyal understanding. I had not just canceled a meeting. I had professionally and with the surgical precision of a corporate executioner annihilated my son's career. I had declared him in the most formal terms possible a failure, unfit to lead, unworthy of the name he carried. "I will draft it immediately, Elias," Diane said, her voice a quiet, terrible promise. "It will be on his desk by the time he wakes up in his hotel in the morning. And a copy will be waiting in Marcus's inbox." "Thank you, Diane," I said. "That will be all for tonight." I hung up the phone. I kept driving my old truck, a steady, reliable presence in the dark. The road ahead was empty. I did not know what the morning would bring. I did not know what would become of my son or my family, but I knew one thing with an absolute, unshakable certainty. I had protected my legacy. I had honored my wife, and I had kept my promise. The bill had now finally been paid in full. The truck's engine was a low, steady rumble, a faithful, uncomplicated sound in a world that had become twisted and false. The lights of the wedding venue were a fading, gaudy smear in my rearview mirror. The night was dark, the road was empty, and the work was almost done. I had dismantled the party, the beautiful, expensive stage upon which they had chosen to humiliate me. I had annihilated the future, the $50 million deal that was to have been my son's coronation. I had taken away the scaffolding of their ambition. But there was one last thing, one final and most intimate detail: the honeymoon. I thought back to a few months ago, sitting in my office, a younger, more naive, and infinitely more hopeful version of myself. I remembered the joy I had felt as I personally arranged their wedding night and the start of their new life. It was not just a hotel room. It was the presidential suite at the Four Seasons, the finest hotel in Atlanta. A sprawling, magnificent space with panoramic views of the city, a private terrace, and a level of service that was the very definition of the luxury I had built my life's work on. It was to be a gift, a symbol of my love and my hope for their future. I had imagined them arriving there exhausted and happy, a bottle of the finest champagne, my champagne waiting on ice for them. I had imagined them starting their life together in a place of beauty and peace, a place I had provided. I thought of my own honeymoon with Rose. We had driven to Savannah in my old beat-up pickup truck. We had stayed in a small, simple motel a few blocks from the ocean. We had eaten fried shrimp from a paper plate, and we had walked on the beach at midnight, the salt spray on our faces, our hands clasped together, our hearts so full of a future that felt as vast and as beautiful as the ocean itself. We had nothing, and we had everything. My son and his new wife, they had everything, and they had nothing. The booking for the Four Seasons was not in my son's name. It was not a gift card. It was a corporate reservation made under the Vance Premier Logistics account. It was a perquisite, a privilege extended to the senior leadership of my company. It was not a gift of love from a father. It was an asset of the company. The same company whose founder, whose patriarch, whose very name they had just so publicly and so profoundly disrespected. The father in me was a ghost, a ruin. But the CEO, the man whose name was on that corporate account, he was very much alive, and he had a fiduciary duty to protect the assets and the reputation of his brand. I picked up the phone. I did not need to think. The decision had already been made in the cold, clear logic of consequence. I pressed the single button on my speed dial. The call connected instantly. "Diane?" Her voice was a calm, steady anchor in the darkness. "Elias," I said. "One final detail." "I'm ready," she said. "The reservation at the Four Seasons." I said, my voice as flat and as unemotional as a financial report. "The presidential suite. It is booked for Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Vance for the next 3 nights before their flight to Dubai." "Yes," she said. "I have it right here. Billed to the primary corporate account." "Marcus and his wife," I said, my voice cold and precise, "have demonstrated tonight that they are not fit to represent the values of this company. Privileges are earned, Diane, and their privileges have just been revoked." "Understood," she said, and I could hear the grim final satisfaction in her voice. "I will call the hotel immediately and cancel the reservation. The charges will be reversed." "Yes," I said, "and Diane, when the hotel asks for a reason, you will tell them the truth. You will tell them that the reservation has been canceled by the CEO due to gross personal and professional misconduct on the part of the intended guests." "Yes, Elias," she said. "I will make sure the message is delivered loud and clear." I hung up the phone. I kept driving the dark road unfolding before me. I pictured the scene. I pictured them arriving at the hotel sometime after midnight, flush with the relief of having escaped the disastrous party. I pictured them walking up to the grand polished check-in desk, giving their name, expecting to be handed the key to their palace in the sky. And I pictured the polite professional and deeply apologetic confusion on the clerk's face. I pictured the hushed, urgent phone call to the night manager. And I pictured the final devastating and deeply public humiliation of a credit card being declined of a reservation that no longer existed. They would not be starting their new life in a palace. They would be starting it as it was meant to continue, homeless and alone in the cold, hard, and unforgiving world they had made for themselves. I pulled into my long, dark driveway. I cut the engine. The house was dark. The night's work was finally and completely done. I slept that night for the first time in what felt like a year. It was a deep, dreamless, and profoundly peaceful sleep, the kind that only comes when a great heavy weight has finally been lifted from your soul. I woke with the sun, the familiar gentle light of a new day filtering through my bedroom window. I made myself a pot of coffee, the rich, dark aroma, a comforting and familiar friend. I sat on my back porch, the one that overlooked the quiet sleeping gardens of my home, and I took a slow, deliberate sip. The world was quiet. The war was over. And I was at peace. The jarring, frantic ringing of my phone at 7 a.m. was a violent intrusion into that peace. It was Marcus. I knew it would be. I let it ring for a moment longer, a small, final act of control. Then I answered. "Hello, son," I said, my voice as calm and as steady as the morning itself. "Dad?" His voice was a ragged, breathless explosion of pure, unadulterated panic. It was the voice of a man whose entire world was on fire. "Dad, what is going on? It's a nightmare. A complete nightmare." I took another slow sip of my coffee. "Good morning to you too, Marcus," I said. "I'm surprised you're not at the airport. Isn't your flight to Dubai in a few hours?" "The flight is gone." He practically screamed, his voice cracking with a frantic, childish terror. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. We went to check in online and the tickets, they're just gone. The airline says the reservation was never confirmed. And the hotel, Dad, the hotel." He trailed off, his voice, a choked, strangled sound. "What about the hotel, son?" I asked, my voice still perfectly and I am sure infuriatingly calm. "We got there last night after everything," he stammered. "And they had no record of our reservation. They said the presidential suite had been canceled. Canceled, Dad. They looked at us like we were criminals. Chloe had to put the deposit for a standard room on her own credit card. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? Humiliating." The word was a small, bitter, and deeply satisfying piece of poetry. "Yes, Marcus," I said quietly, I think I have some idea of what that feels like." The quiet irony of my words seemed to fly right over his head. He was too consumed by his own panic. "It has to be a mistake," he insisted, his voice a desperate, pleading whine. "A glitch in the system. Someone at the company must have screwed up the corporate account. You have to call them, Dad. You have to fix this. Our honeymoon, our trip, it's all ruined. Fix this." The same words his wife had used. The same desperate plea from a child who has broken a toy and now wants his father to magically put it back together. The time for fixing things was over. It was time for consequences. "Marcus," I said, and my voice was no longer the voice of a father, but the voice of a CEO. It was the voice I used for underperforming executives just before I fired them. "There was no glitch. There was no mistake. The system is working perfectly." The silence on the other end of the line was a sound of pure, uncomprehending shock. What do you mean?" he whispered. "I mean," I said, my voice as cold and as clear as glass, "that the presidential suite at the Four Seasons and the first-class tickets to Dubai were not wedding gifts, son. They were corporate assets. They were privileges extended to a senior executive of Vance Premier Logistics for the purpose of conducting company business. And last night you and your wife demonstrated in the most public and unprofessional way imaginable that you are not fit to enjoy those privileges." He was silent. The frantic, panicked energy was gone, replaced by a new and far more terrible quiet. He was beginning to understand. "The reservations were not a mistake," I continued, my voice a quiet final judgment. "They were an expense. An expense that I, as the CEO of this company, have deemed to be no longer justified. Therefore, I had them canceled, effective last night. Your access to the corporate accounts and all the privileges that come with them have been suspended pending a full review of your conduct. I took a final sip of my coffee. It was still warm. The sun was rising. It was a beautiful day. Welcome to the first day of the rest of your life, son, I said. I suggest you start making your own reservations. The phone in my hand was a conduit of pure, undiluted chaos. My son's voice, a ragged, frantic thing I barely recognized, was a storm of panicked words and strangled breaths. He was a man drowning, and he was calling the very person who had just calmly and deliberately kicked his lifeboat out from under him. He had just told me about the hotel, the canceled suite, the public humiliation. He was waiting for my shock, for my anger, for my promise to fix it. He was waiting for the father, but the father was no longer taking his calls. A glitch in the system, Marcus, I repeated, and my voice was a quiet, dangerous thing in the peaceful morning air. A screw-up with the corporate account. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The warmth of it was a small, solid, and deeply satisfying reality. No, I said. There was no glitch. There was no mistake. The system, I assure you, is working perfectly. The silence on the other end of the line was a sound I was beginning to enjoy. It was the sound of a man's entire worldview, his entire sense of entitlement cracking down the middle. What do you mean? He finally whispered, his voice a small, terrified thing. And then I gave him the cold, hard, and beautifully logical explanation. I mean, son. I began my voice the calm, measured tone of a CEO delivering a final performance review that you and your wife have been operating under a very serious misapprehension. You seem to believe that the services of Vance Premier Logistics are your birthright. They are not. They are a business. And last night you and the bride made a very clear business decision. He was silent. I knew he was trying to follow my logic, a logic that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with cause and effect. Your wife, I continued, made a specific and frankly quite public request regarding my status at the event. I was not to be treated as the father of the groom. I was not to be treated as a guest of honor. I was in no uncertain terms relegated to the status of a vendor, a member of the staff, the man who was paying the bills but who was not welcome at the party. I paused, letting the ugly truth of his own actions settle on him. I accepted those terms, Marcus. I was a quiet, and I hope a very professional vendor for the duration of the evening. But what does that have to do with the hotel? He pleaded, his voice a child's whine. Everything, I said, and my voice was as cold and as sharp as a shard of glass. A vendor's services are contracted for a specific time and place. The contracted event, your wedding reception, concluded at approximately 11 p.m. last night when the last of your disappointed guests departed. Therefore, at that time, all services provided by the vendor Vance Premier Logistics were also concluded. I took another sip of my coffee. That included, but was not limited to, the jazz band, the premium bar, the floral arrangements, the fireworks display, and of course any and all corporate travel and accommodation privileges that were booked through the company account for events taking place after the contracted service had ended. The silence was absolute now. It was the silence of a man who had just walked with his eyes wide open into a perfect and perfectly logical trap. You have confused the privileges of a senior executive with the birthright of a son. I said, my voice quiet, but every word a hammer blow. Last night you made a choice. You chose to be my client, not my son. And as a client, your services have expired. The company is no longer responsible for your travel, your accommodation, or your future. Welcome to the real world, Marcus. It's a place where nothing is free, and a place where respect is the only currency that truly matters. My son's panicked voice was a frantic buzzing insect in the serene quiet of my morning. A review of my conduct. He repeated, his voice a mixture of disbelief and a dawning childish terror. Dad, this is insane. This is about a hotel room. You're ruining my life over a hotel room. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The rich, dark liquid was a small, solid anchor of reality in the storm of his hysteria. No, son, I said, my voice calm and measured. It was never about the hotel room. The hotel was just a symptom. The disease is a fundamental lack of understanding on your part. I looked out at this garden, at the way the morning sun was catching the dew on the leaves of the old magnolia tree. "You have been looking at the frosting, Marcus," I said, the metaphor forming itself in my mind. "You've been so focused on the sweet decorative frosting that you never once bothered to ask about the cake." "The cake? What are you talking about?" he pleaded, his voice cracking. And so I told him. I laid out the truth for him, not with anger, but with the cold, dispassionate precision of a CEO delivering a final, devastating quarterly report. "The trip to Dubai was not a honeymoon, son," I said. "It was a coronation, your coronation." I explained everything: the 6 months of secret negotiations, the $50 million contract with Sheikh Al Jamil, the meeting that I had personally arranged, a meeting that was designed to be his moment, the moment he stepped out of my shadow and became the undisputed future of this company. The presidential suite, the first-class tickets, they were not a vacation. They were the stagecraft for the most important business meeting of his life. The silence on the other end of the line was a sound I had never heard before. It was not the silence of anger or of shock. It was the sound of a man's entire reality being unwritten in an instant. "That was my gift to you, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "Not the party, not the champagne, the future. A future you were about to earn on your own merits. A future you have just with your own actions and your own silence thrown into a fire." "No," he whispered, the word a ghost of a sound. "No, it can't be." "You don't have to take my word for it," I said. "I believe the Sheikh is a more direct communicator. Check your email, Marcus, your corporate account. I believe a message arrived for you from Dubai about an hour ago." I waited. The silence stretched, filled now with a new frantic energy. I could hear the fumbling sound of a phone being passed, the frantic tapping of fingers on a screen. I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath, and then there was nothing, just a dead, airless quiet. I knew what he was reading. Diane had forwarded me a copy. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic execution. It was from the Sheikh's chief of staff, a formal and utterly final communication. It began with polite regrets and then went for the kill. I had the words memorized. "Due to deeply troubling concerns regarding the professional decorum and future leadership of Vance Premier Logistics, we must unfortunately withdraw our proposal at this time. Sheikh Al Jamil's business philosophy is built upon a foundation of mutual respect and strong family values. The behavior witnessed at last night's event has demonstrated a profound disregard for those foundational values. We cannot in good faith proceed with a partnership under these circumstances. The $50 million proposal is hereby formally withdrawn." A sound came through the phone. It was not a word. It was a low, guttural animal noise, the sound of a man who has just been disemboweled and is watching in disbelief as his own life spills out onto the floor. I heard the clatter of his phone as it slipped from his numb fingers and hit the floor. And then I heard her voice. Not a voice. A shriek. It was Chloe. "What have you done?" she screamed, her voice a raw, ragged thing of pure, undiluted fury. "You monster, you jealous, evil old man. You couldn't stand to see him happy, could you? You couldn't stand to see us have something of our own." I listened to her tirade for a moment, the wild, baseless accusations of a woman whose payday had just been vaporized. Then I took a final satisfying sip of my coffee, and I raised the phone to my lips. "The conversation," I said, my voice calm and final, "is over." And I hung up. The sun was higher in the sky now. It was a beautiful day. I hung up the phone, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. The sun was higher now, a warm, benevolent presence on my face. The storm had passed. The war was won. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The rich, dark liquid was a small, quiet celebration, a toast to a victory that had been 50 years in the making. I had not just saved my company, I had saved my name. I had honored my wife, and I had in the most painful and necessary way begun the process of saving my son from himself. I knew the quiet would not last. The initial shock on their end would soon give way to the aftershocks, the frantic, chaotic scramble of people who have just had the very ground beneath their feet turn to dust. I did not have to wait long. Not 5 minutes later, the phone rang again, its shrill, insistent cry a jarring intrusion into the morning's peace. It was Marcus's number. I considered for a moment not answering. I considered letting it ring until it died a final silent statement that the conversation was truly over. But I knew that would be the coward's way out. I had started this. I would see it through to its bitter, necessary end. I answered the call. "Hello, Marcus." The sound that came through the receiver was not my son's voice. It was a hollow, rattling sound, the sound of a man trying to speak through a throat full of broken glass. "Dad," he choked out the word, a ghost of a sound. "Dad, you can't." He couldn't finish the sentence. He couldn't form the words. It was the sound of a man's soul breaking. It was the sound of a man who had just seen the full catastrophic scope of the ruin he had brought upon himself. It was the sound of my son collapsing. And then the sound was gone, replaced by a furious, frantic rustling, and then a new voice, a voice that was not broken at all, but was instead a raw, ragged shriek of pure, undiluted fury. "You," it was Chloe. "You evil, jealous old man. You couldn't stand it, could you? You couldn't stand to see him happy. You couldn't stand to see us have something of our own." I said nothing. I just held the phone to my ear and I listened. I listened as she poured out all the venom, all the greed, all the ugly, entitled rage that had been hiding behind her perfect, pretty smile. "You think you're so powerful, don't you?" she screamed, her voice cracking with the force of her own hatred. "Sitting in your dusty old house pulling your little strings, you've destroyed him. You've destroyed everything just to prove you're still in charge." I remained silent. I was the stone wall against which she was breaking herself. Her rage was a wild, impotent storm, and my silence was the calm, unshakable eye at its center. "I'll get a lawyer," she shrieked, her threats now becoming as desperate as they were pathetic. "I'll sue you for everything you have. I'll tell every newspaper in this city what you did. I will ruin you. I will ruin your precious legacy." I let her go on her voice, a shrill, ugly noise in the beautiful, peaceful morning. I let her exhaust herself, her threats growing wilder, her accusations more and more unhinged. She was a cornered animal, biting and clawing at the bars of a cage she couldn't see, a cage of her own making. Finally, she ran out of breath, her tirade ending in a series of ragged, gasping sobs. The storm had blown itself out. In the quiet that followed, I finally spoke. My voice was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was just tired. "Are you finished?" I asked. The simple, quiet question seemed to stun her into silence. "Because if you are," I continued, "I have work to do. I have a company to run, a company that as of this morning has a very serious leadership problem that needs to be addressed." I paused for a moment, and then I delivered the final and most devastating blow of all. "Goodbye, Chloe." And before she could utter another word, before she could unleash another wave of her useless, impotent fury, I ended the call. The click of the phone disconnecting was a small, quiet, and deeply satisfying sound. It was the sound of a door being closed, of a cancer being cut out. The line was now finally clear. The quiet that followed my hanging up the phone was a different kind of silence. It was not the peaceful, restorative quiet of the early morning. It was the heavy, charged silence of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped, a silence thick with the smell of smoke and the ghosts of the fallen. I had won, but the victory was a bitter, lonely thing. I had not just defeated my son's ambition. I had been forced to annihilate it. I had been forced to become the very thing I had never wanted to be, the cause of my own child's pain. I stayed on the porch, the untouched coffee cup now cold in my hands. I did not want to go back inside. The house was full of ghosts, the ghost of a happy wedding that had never been, the ghost of a proud father. I could no longer be the ghost of a son I no longer knew. I simply sat, and I watched the sun climb higher in the sky, a silent, impartial witness to the wreckage of my family. I knew the quiet would not last. The initial emotional shockwave of the morning's revelations would soon be followed by the calculated, strategic aftershocks. The time for tears and screams was over. It was now time for the lawyers. The phone rang at precisely 9 a.m. I knew it would. I looked at the caller ID. It was an unfamiliar number with a downtown Atlanta area code. I answered it. "Elias Vance." "Mr. Vance," a voice said. It was a voice as smooth, as polished, and as cold as a marble tabletop. It was the voice of a very expensive lawyer. "This is Jonathan Davies. I represent Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Vance. I believe we have some urgent matters to discuss." "Do we, Mr. Davies?" I asked, my own voice quiet, a stark contrast to his aggressive professionalism. "Yes, we do," he said, his tone dripping with a barely concealed condescension. He thought he was talking to a sentimental, emotional old man he could easily intimidate. "I have been instructed by my clients to inform you that your actions over the past 24 hours constitute a clear and malicious case of tortious interference with a contract, not to mention the infliction of extreme emotional distress. The financial and reputational damages are, and I quote my clients, incalculable." He paused, letting the weight of his legal jargon hang in the air. "Now," he continued, his voice shifting from threat to a false conciliatory tone, "my clients are, despite your recent behavior, willing to be reasonable. They are prepared to forego legal action in exchange for the immediate and unconditional reinstatement of the Dubai contract, a full and public apology, and the transfer of a significant portion of Vance Premier Logistics into a trust controlled by my client, Mr. Marcus Vance." I listened to his ridiculous, audacious demands, and I felt nothing. No anger, no fear, only a profound and deeply weary pity for the man who was paying this fool's exorbitant hourly rate. He was a gladiator who had just marched confidently into the wrong arena. "Mr. Davies," I said, my voice still perfectly, and I am sure infuriatingly calm, "you seem to be under a misapprehension." "I assure you, Mr. Vance, I am not," he said, a note of irritation entering his voice. "The legal standing here is quite clear." "No, I mean you are under the misapprehension that you are speaking to the correct person," I said. The silence on the other end of the line was a thing of beauty. "You see, Mr. Davies," I continued, "you are speaking to Elias Vance, a private citizen, a retiree who is currently enjoying a cup of coffee on his back porch. The man you need to be speaking to, the legal entity you have just threatened with a lawsuit, is Vance Premier Logistics, a multi-million-dollar corporation. I am merely its majority shareholder. I am not its legal department." I let that sink in. I could almost hear the frantic, panicked recalculation happening in his head. "If you wish to discuss a legal matter with the company," I said, my voice full of a helpful, friendly tone, "you will need to contact our corporate counsel. Her name is Eleanor Mayhew. She is the head of our legal department. She is a truly brilliant, and I must warn you, a very, very thorough lawyer. I can give you her number if you like." "Oui." He was speechless. He was a family lawyer, a specialist in divorces and petty contract disputes. He had come prepared to bully an old man. He had just discovered that he had in fact just threatened to sue a corporate leviathan with a legal team that could probably buy and sell his entire firm before their morning coffee break. "So," I concluded, "if you would like to have your urgent discussion with Ms. Mayhew, please feel free to do so. I wish you the very best of luck, but my conversation with you is over. I am a private citizen, Mr. Davies, and I am on my own private time." I took a slow, satisfying sip of my now cold coffee. "You have a wonderful day." And I hung up. The morning was gray and cool, a somber mirror of my own soul. After the lawyer's call, I did not stay at home. The house which had been my sanctuary now felt like a mausoleum for a family that no longer existed. There was only one place I could go, the only other place I had ever truly called home. I drove downtown. The city was waking up a slow, steady thrum of commerce and ambition. I pulled into my reserved spot in the parking garage of the Vance Tower, a gleaming structure of black glass and steel that was a testament to a lifetime of impossible dreams made real. As I walked into the lobby, the quiet hum of productivity, the scent of clean carpets and fresh coffee settled over me like a familiar, comforting blanket. This was a world I understood, a world of order, of consequences, of things that made sense. The employees I passed in the hallway, my people greeted me with a quiet, respectful deference. "Good morning, Mr. Vance." They did not know the details of the drama that had consumed my last 36 hours, but they were a loyal crew. They were sailors on a steady ship, and they could feel the distant tremor of a storm. They saw the return of their captain to the bridge, and their faces were a mixture of relief and a quiet professional concern. Diane was waiting for me outside my office. She held a steaming mug of coffee, black, just the way I liked it. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her eyes, full of a fierce, unwavering loyalty, said everything. She had been the executor of my will, the silent instrument of my justice. She handed me the coffee. It was a transfer of power, an acknowledgement that the war was over and the king was back in his castle. I walked into my office. It was a large corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city I had helped to build. The walls were not covered in art, but in history. A framed photograph of my first beat-up cargo van. A picture of me and Rose young and full of a desperate, beautiful hope breaking ground on this very building. And a picture of a 10-year-old Marcus, his arm around my shoulder, his face alight with a boy's uncomplicated adoration, standing on the unfinished top floor of this tower looking out at a future I thought I was building for him. I stood there for a long time looking at that picture. The boy in that photograph, the one with the bright, trusting eyes, he was a ghost now. And the man he had become was a stranger. I walked behind my desk, a massive piece of mahogany that had been with me for 40 years, and I sat down in my chair. The familiar, solid feel of the worn leather was a grounding force. This was not the chair of a father. This was the throne of a founder. And from this throne I had a duty, not to my son, but to my company, to the 500 other families whose livelihoods depended on the integrity of the Vance name. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Diane," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Please come in." She entered a moment later, a notepad in her hand, her face a mask of professional readiness. "Yes, Elias." "Take a memo," I said, "to all department heads. Effective immediately, all projects, contracts, and accounts currently under the senior management of Mr. Marcus Vance are hereby placed on indefinite suspension pending a full-scale leadership review." Diane's pen flew across the page, her face revealing nothing. "All client-facing responsibilities and signatory powers held by Mr. Vance are to be reassigned to you as acting chief operating officer until further notice. Mr. Vance is to have no further contact with any of our clients, partners, or vendors. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Elias," she said. "And the review?" "The review," I said, leaning back in my chair and looking out at the city, "will be a long and a very, very thorough process. It will be a top-to-bottom evaluation of an executive who has demonstrated a catastrophic failure of judgment and a profound lack of respect for the core values of this company." I paused, and the weight of what I was about to say settled on me. "For now," I concluded, "my son is no longer an executive. He is a liability, and we will treat him as such." I had not just suspended his projects. I had suspended him. I had placed him in a corporate purgatory, and I had no idea if he would ever find his way out. The Vance Tower was an ecosystem with its own weather. For 48 hours the forecast had been tense and still the quiet before a hurricane. The memo I had sent, the one suspending my son from his own future, had landed with the force of a silent seismic shock. But the business world, like nature, abhors a vacuum, and into the vacuum of information that I had created the rumors began to rush. I did not have to seek them out. They came to me, brought to my desk like a morning intelligence briefing by the one person I trusted to filter the noise from the signal, Diane. She entered my office in the late afternoon, a slim folder in her hand, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "The phones have been active this morning, Elias," she said, her voice a low, even murmur. She did not call it gossip. She called it market chatter. "Chatter about what?" I asked, though I already knew. "Dubai," she said. "The story is out. Not the whole story, of course, but the result. The $50 million deal with Sheikh Al Jamil is dead, and the name Marcus Vance is attached to the failure." In the high-stakes, tightly-knit world of Atlanta's corporate elite, a world I had navigated for 50 years, a deal of that magnitude doesn't just quietly fall apart, it implodes, and the shrapnel hits everyone. Diane laid out the narrative that was beginning to congeal, passed in hushed tones over expensive lunches and through encrypted text messages. The official story, the one being spun by the Sheikhs and Robert Blackwood's people, was a masterclass in corporate assassination. There had been a catastrophic failure of leadership, a profound lack of professional decorum from the Vance side, whispers of a public family-related meltdown at a private event. My name, Elias Vance, was being carefully and respectfully protected. I was the patriarch, the founder, the steady hand, who was now, according to the rumor mill, engaged in a desperate last-minute attempt to salvage the company's reputation from the reckless actions of my heir apparent. They did not know the truth, but the story they were telling was in its own way true enough. Chloe's name was also in the wind. She was being cast as the ambitious social climbing wife, the beautiful destructive force who had pushed her husband beyond his capabilities and had alienated the one-man Sheikh al-Jamil whose values were famously traditional. She was the architect of her own social ruin. She had wanted to be the star of Atlanta society, and now she was, a falling star. And the practical effects? I asked, my voice quiet. Diane opened the folder. The first ripple came an hour ago, she said. A call from the CEO of the Tech Campus project, our largest client. He wants a face-to-face meeting next week. He was very polite. But the message was clear. He wants assurances about the stability and future leadership of this company. I just nodded. The first domino had fallen. A client who had trusted us for a decade was now nervous, because my son and his wife had been careless. They had been disrespectful. They had failed to understand that in our world, a world built on handshakes and reputations that take a lifetime to build trust is not a renewable resource. Once it is burned, it is gone forever. And Marcus? I asked. He has been in his office all morning, Diane said, her voice devoid of emotion. The door is closed. He is not taking any calls. I felt no satisfaction in this. I felt no vengeful joy. I felt only the grim, necessary calculus of a founder protecting his life's work. I had spent 50 years building the Vance name into a symbol of absolute, unshakable integrity. And I had just witnessed my own son and his wife attempt to trade that name, that legacy, for a night of social triumph. I was a builder. And I was now, for the first time in my life, in the business of demolition. The demolition of my own son's career. I looked out the window at the city, at the countless buildings my company had helped to create, at the visible concrete legacy of my life. And I knew with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the steel beams in the tower beneath me that the work was not yet done. The days that followed were a quiet, brutal education in the laws of cause and effect. The news of the Dubai contract's collapse had hit the Atlanta business community like a shockwave, and my son Marcus Vance was at its epicenter. His name, which had once been a synonym for a golden future, had become a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and over expensive lunches. His fall had been as swift as it had been spectacular. I had built his pedestal, and I had kicked it out from under him. The silence from his end was absolute. There were no more angry calls, no more legal threats, only a vast, empty quiet. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, the quiet broke. Diane's voice came through my office intercom, as cool and as unflappable as ever. "Elias," she said, "you have some visitors, Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Vance. They do not have an appointment." I looked out my window at the city below. "Send them in, Diane," I said, "and please hold all my calls." They walked into my office, and the change in them was staggering. They were not the proud, glittering monarchs of the wedding reception. They were refugees from a kingdom that had burned to the ground. Chloe, who had always been a vision of perfect, polished confidence, looked diminished. She wore a simple dress, her hair was pulled back without its usual perfect styling, and her face was pale and drawn, the brilliant, weaponized smile completely gone. She looked like a soldier who had lost her armor. But the change in my son was the most profound. He was a ghost. His expensive suit hung on him as if he had lost weight. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes, when he finally dared to meet mine, were hollowed out, filled with a shame and a desperation so profound it was almost painful to witness. He looked like a man who had not slept in a week, a man who had been haunted by the ghost of his own future. They stood awkwardly in the middle of my office, a vast, silent space that now seemed to amplify their powerlessness. "Dad," Marcus began, his voice a hoarse, broken thing. We came to apologize." Chloe, who had always been the one to lead to control, now stood slightly behind him, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I am so sorry," Marcus continued, the words tumbling out in a desperate, unpracticed rush. "For everything. For my silence. For my weakness. I let Chloe. I let the wedding. I lost sight of what was important. I failed you, Dad. As a son and as an executive. The Dubai deal. I know what that meant. I know what I lost. And I am so sorry." His apology was a raw, bleeding wound. It was the apology of a man who was sorry for the consequences, for the catastrophic loss he had incurred. I listened, my face a mask of neutral professional calm. Then it was Chloe's turn. She looked up, and I saw that she had been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen. "Elias," she said, and the use of my first name was a pathetic attempt at a familiarity she had just forfeited. "I have no excuses. My behavior was unforgivable. I was insecure. I was intimidated by your legacy, by this company. I wanted the wedding to be mine, to be ours, and I was cruel, and I was petty, and I was wrong. I have ruined your son. I have ruined everything, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting it." It was a good performance. The tears were real, I was sure, but they were the tears of a woman who had just lost her access to a corporate credit card and a future of effortless luxury. They were tears of self-pity cloaked in the language of remorse. I let their apologies hang in the air, a silent, pathetic testament to their desperation. I let the quiet stretch, a long, uncomfortable moment where they were forced to stand in the wreckage they had created. Finally, I spoke. My voice was not the voice of a father. It was the voice of a CEO, a man who had just listened to a presentation from a failing department. "I have heard your apologies." I said, my voice as calm and as cold as the glass of the window behind me. "And I will take them under advisement." I did not accept them. I did not reject them. I filed them like any other piece of unimportant correspondence. "However," I continued, "your personal feelings on the matter are at this moment irrelevant to the business at hand. You have, through your combined actions, created a significant liability for this company. You have damaged our reputation with our most important international partner. You have jeopardized our largest domestic account. You have demonstrated a catastrophic failure of leadership. My personal feelings as a father are a luxury I cannot currently afford. My only concern is the health and the future of Vance Premier Logistics." I looked at them, two broken children in my office, and I felt nothing but a cold, hard, and necessary resolve. "The apology is noted, but the review of your conduct, Marcus, will continue, and you will be judged not by your words of regret, but by the consequences of your actions." The days that followed their disastrous visit to my office were a quiet, cold war. The silence from their end was no longer the silence of shock, but the silence of powerlessness. They had no moves left to make. The legal threats had evaporated. The angry phone calls had ceased. They were adrift in a sea of their own making, and they had finally, it seemed, realized that I was the only one with a lifeboat. The request for a formal meeting came not from them, but from my own legal counsel, Eleanor Mayhew. "Mr. Davies has been in touch, Elias," she had told me over the phone, her voice full of a dry amusement. "His clients are requesting a mediation. They are, and I quote, eager to find a path towards reconciliation and a productive future." The legal jargon was a pathetic, transparent cloak for their desperation. They were begging for an audience. I considered refusing. I considered letting them twist in the wind, a just punishment for their arrogance and their cruelty. But I was not just a father, I was a founder, and the situation was a festering wound in the side of my company. My son, my suspended executive, was a ghost in the hallways, his name a subject of hushed, speculative whispers among my employees. My largest clients were still nervous. The situation required a resolution, not for them, for the company. "I will grant them a meeting, Eleanor," I had said, "but not a mediation, and not on their terms, on mine." And so, on a cold gray Monday morning, they were summoned. Not to my home, which was no longer a place they were welcome, not to my private office, which was a place of fatherly history they had forfeited the right to enter. They were summoned to the main corporate boardroom on the top floor of the Vance Tower, a place of cold, hard, and impersonal power. I was there first, seated at the head of the long, polished mahogany table that could seat 30. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, God's-eye view of the city, a view of the empire I had built. I was not alone. At my right hand sat Diane, her notepad and pen placed perfectly before her, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She was not just my COO. She was my witness, my enforcer. Her presence was a silent, powerful statement. This was not a family counseling session. This was a corporate tribunal. When my assistant showed them in, the change in them was stark. They were entering my world now, and they knew it. Marcus, in a simple, dark suit, looked like a junior associate on his way to his own firing. His eyes were downcast, his shoulders slumped. Chloe beside him was a ghost of her former self. The fire was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful anxiety. They looked small and lost, and utterly out of their depth in this room that was so suffused with my power. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm, neutral, the voice of the chairman of the board. I did not stand. I did not offer a handshake. I gestured to the two empty chairs at the far end of the long table, a deliberate, calculated act of placing them at a physical and symbolic distance. "Please have a seat." They sat, two chastened children called to the principal's office. The silence in the room was immense, broken only by the quiet, almost imperceptible scratching of Diane's pen as she noted the time. I let the silence stretch, a tool I had often used in negotiations, letting them marinate in their own discomfort. Finally, when the quiet had become almost unbearable, I spoke. "Thank you for coming." I began, my voice as cold and as polished as the table between us. "Let's be perfectly clear about the purpose of this meeting. We are not here to relitigate the events of the wedding. We are not here to discuss your feelings of regret or my feelings of disappointment. Those are personal matters, and this is a place of business." I looked at my son, his eyes still fixed on the polished surface of the table. "We are here for one reason and one reason only, to discuss the quantifiable and catastrophic damage your combined actions have caused to the Vance Premier Logistics brand, and to determine what, if any, future Mr. Marcus Vance has with this company." I turned my gaze to my silent, loyal second-in-command. "Diane," I said, my voice a quiet final command, "let's begin with your report on the financial impact of the Al-Jamil contract cancellation." And as she began to speak, her voice a calm, factual recitation of their failure, I watched my son visibly shrink in his chair. The trial had begun. The silence that followed Diane's report was heavier than the polished mahogany of the table. The numbers were cold, they were hard, and they were damning. She had, with her characteristic surgical precision, laid out the full financial and reputational cost of the wedding fiasco, the lost contract with the sheikh, the nervous, now demanding calls from our largest domestic client, the projected cost of a public relations campaign to repair the damage to the Vance name. It was a multi-million-dollar bonfire, and the two people who had lit the match were sitting at the far end of my table. I let the final terrible number hang in the air for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then I turned my gaze to my son. He looked as if he had been physically beaten. His face was ashen, his eyes fixed on a single invisible point on the table in front of him. "As you can see," I began, my voice the calm, dispassionate tone of a chairman addressing a board meeting, "we have a problem, a significant and a very expensive problem of leadership." I looked at them both, two broken children who had come begging for forgiveness. "Your apologies," I said, "are noted, but an apology does not restore a client's confidence. An apology does not magically reappear a $50 million contract. An apology in the world of business is an insufficient currency." I paused, and I saw a flicker of something in my son's eyes. The final, desperate terror of a man who believes he is about to be fired by his own father. "Therefore," I said, "I have made a decision. Marcus, you are not fired." A small, choked sound of relief escaped his lips. Chloe, who had been as still as a statue, seemed to wilt, a wave of relief washing over her. They thought the worst was over. They were wrong. "I will not fire you," I continued, my voice as cold and as hard as stone, "for one reason and one reason only. Your name is Vance, and I will not have it said that a Vance has failed so spectacularly that he was cast out of his own company. My pride, it seems, is a more powerful force than my disappointment." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. "You will not be fired, Marcus. You will be reborn. As of this moment, your title of Executive Vice President is revoked. Your office on this floor is being cleared out. Your corporate credit cards have been canceled. Your company car is being returned. Your salary has been adjusted downwards by 90%. He stared at me, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. "Your new title," I said, "is Junior Logistics Coordinator Grade 1. Your new office is a desk in the main dispatch warehouse down by the airport. Your new start time is 6 a.m. You will report to the shift supervisor, a man named Frank, who has been with this company for 30 years and who has forgotten more about logistics than you have ever known. You will learn the smell of diesel fumes and cardboard. You will learn how to schedule a freight shipment, how to manage an inventory, how to talk to a union driver. You will learn this business again from the ground up, from the warehouse floor. You will learn what it means to work." I turned my gaze to Chloe. The relief had vanished from her face, replaced by a look of pure, horrified disbelief. "And you, my dear," I said, and my voice was devoid of all warmth, "you are a non-entity to this company. You are no longer welcome in this building. You will have no further contact with any employee of Vance Premier Logistics for any reason. Your access has been revoked. If you need to speak with your husband, you will call his personal cell phone on his own time. Is that clear? She just stared at me, her mouth slightly open, speechless. I turned back to my son. This is my offer, Marcus. I said, my voice quiet but final. It is your only offer. You have a choice. You can accept this opportunity to earn back your name, to earn back your place in this company one day at a time, one box at a time. Or you can walk out of that door right now with nothing. No job, no severance, no inheritance, and no father. The choice, I said, leaning back in my chair, is yours. The words of my ultimatum settled in the vast, silent boardroom, each one a stone dropped into a deep, still well. The choice I had offered my son was not a choice at all. It was a crossroads. One path led to a future of humiliation, of hard labor, of a slow, painful climb back from the abyss he had dug for himself. The other path led to an immediate and absolute oblivion. No job, no inheritance, no father. Nothing. I watched him. His head was bowed. His hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists on the polished mahogany of the table. He was a man on a precipice, staring down at the wreckage of his own life. A part of me, the wounded father, the man who had been so publicly and so profoundly betrayed, almost hoped he would stand up and walk out. It would be easier, cleaner, a final definitive amputation. But the founder, the man who had built this company from a single rusty van, the man whose name was on the side of the building, he hoped for something else. He was waiting to see if there was any steel left in his son's spine, or if it had all been melted down and remade into the cheap, glittering jewelry his wife so admired. It was Chloe who spoke first. Her voice was not the shriek of the wedding reception, but something far more dangerous. It was a low, venomous whisper, a serpent's hiss in the funereal quiet of the room. "Don't you dare," she said, her words directed not at me, but at her husband. "Don't you dare let him do this to you, to us. We don't need him. We don't need his dusty old company. Let's walk out of here, Marcus, right now. We'll start our own thing. We'll be bigger than he ever was. Let's go." It was a final desperate gambit, a call to pride, a call to the arrogant, entitled man she had so carefully created. She was offering him an escape route, a path that would preserve his ego even if it destroyed his future. She was asking him to choose her vision of him over the terrible, humiliating reality I had just presented. And for a long, terrible moment, I thought he would take it. I saw his shoulders tense. I saw his head begin to lift, a flicker of the old, defiant arrogance returning to his eyes. He was going to stand. He was going to walk. He was going to choose her. He was going to choose nothing. But then he stopped. His eyes, which had been on their way to meet mine in a final act of defiance, fell upon something else. They fell upon the far wall of the boardroom, upon the large, subtly etched glass logo that was the only piece of art in the room. Vance Premier Logistics. Our name. His name. He stared at it, and I saw a new and a far more profound understanding dawn in his eyes. He was not just looking at a logo. He was looking at his entire life. He was looking at his grandfather, whom he had never met, but whose stories I had told him. He was looking at the picture of himself as a 10-year-old boy standing on this very spot when it was just a skeleton of steel and a concrete floor, his hand in mine. He was looking at his own squandered birthright. He finally understood what he was about to lose. It wasn't just the money, it wasn't just the job, it was his name, his story, his past and his future. The choice was not between humiliation and pride. It was a choice between a difficult, painful future and no future at all. A slow, shuddering breath escaped his lips. It was the sound of the man's pride finally and completely breaking. He lifted his head. He did not look at Chloe. He looked at me. And his eyes, for the first time since he was a boy, were clear. The arrogance was gone. The weakness was gone. In their place was only a vast, empty, and deeply sorrowful acceptance. "I understand," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "I accept the terms." Chloe gasped, a sharp, wounded sound of pure, unadulterated betrayal. "Marcus, no," she hissed. But he did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on me. "I'll start on Monday," he said. 6 a.m., at the warehouse. Chloe stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her face was a mask of pure, venomous hatred. She looked at her husband, this man who had just chosen a future of hard labor over a future with her, and she saw a stranger, a traitor. "You are a fool," she spat the words, a final parting shot. And then she turned her head, held high, and she walked out of the boardroom, out of the company, and out of our lives. The door clicked softly shut behind her, and there were three of us in the quiet of a new and a very, very difficult beginning. The soft, definitive click of the boardroom door closing behind Chloe was a sound of profound and irreversible finality. It was the sound of a chapter ending, of a partnership dissolving, of a future being unwritten. And in the vast, silent room, there were only three of us left. Diane, a silent professional witness. Me, a father who had just been forced to destroy his son's world in order to save it. And Marcus, my son. He had not moved. He sat at the far end of the long table, a solitary, shipwrecked figure on a vast, polished sea of mahogany. His head was bowed, his hands were still clenched into fists, but the tension had gone out of them. They were just the empty, forgotten shapes of a fight that was over. He looked broken, but it was a different kind of broken than the frantic, panicked creature he had been an hour ago. That man had been broken by the loss of his money, his status, his future. This man seemed to be broken by something far deeper. He seemed to be broken by the truth. He finally lifted his head. He did not look at Chloe's empty chair. He looked at me. And his eyes, for the first time in years, were completely and devastatingly clear. The arrogance was gone. The weakness was gone. The desperate need for his wife's approval was gone. In their place was only a vast, empty, and deeply sorrowful clarity. He was a man who had just been forced to look at his own soul in a harsh, unflattering light, and he was horrified by what he had seen. "I accept," he whispered again, and the words were not for me. They were for him. A vow. A sentence he was passing on himself. I did not offer him a word of comfort. I did not offer him a hand of fatherly compassion. The time for that was past. This was no longer a family matter. This was a corporate restructuring. I turned my cool, professional gaze to my right hand. "Diane," I said, my voice as calm and as steady as a signed contract. "Please formalize the terms. Draft the official notice of demotion for Mr. Vance, effective immediately. Have the HR department prepare the new employment contract and salary schedule for the junior logistics coordinator position. He will sign it before the end of the day." "Yes, Elias," she said, her pen scratching softly on the notepad, the only sound in the room. "And please," I added, "coordinate with facilities to have his office on this floor cleared out. His personal effects can be boxed up and sent to his home. His new desk will be on the warehouse floor. Make sure it is adequate, nothing more." Every word was a nail in the coffin of his old life. I was deliberately and with surgical precision dismantling the world of privilege I had so foolishly built for him. I was stripping him of everything he had taken for granted, everything his wife had valued. I was leaving him with nothing but his name and a chance, a very small and a very difficult chance, to earn it back. I turned my gaze back to my son. "You will start on Monday, Marcus," I said. 6 a.m. sharp. Frank, your new supervisor, does not tolerate tardiness from anyone." He just nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible movement of his head. He did not argue. He did not plead. He simply accepted. He pushed his chair back, the sound a harsh scrape in the silent room. He stood up, his movements slow, weary, the movements of an old man. He looked at me one last time, and in his eyes I saw not hatred, not resentment, but a glimmer of something I had not seen in a very, very long time. A flicker of respect, and it was a respect born not of love or of fear, but of a shared and brutal understanding of the truth. "Yes, sir." He said the words, a quiet, formal acknowledgement of the new order. Then he turned and walked towards the door. He paused for a moment, his hand on the cool steel handle, and he looked back, not at me, but at the empty chair where his wife had been sitting. His beautiful, ambitious, and now departed wife, the architect of his ruin. And in that single silent glance I saw the true cost of his choice. The marriage I knew was over. He had chosen the name. He had chosen the legacy. He had chosen the long, hard road back. And he was now, for the first time in his life, completely and utterly alone. He opened the door and walked out, closing it softly behind him. The new foundation had been laid, and it was built on the rubble of his entire life. The leaves on the old oak outside my office window had turned from green to a deep, burnished gold. Autumn had settled over the city, a quiet, contemplative season of change. 3 months had passed since the wedding. 3 months of a cold and deeply necessary silence. I had not seen Chloe since she had walked out of the boardroom. I had heard through the legal channels that the divorce was preceding a quiet, transactional end to a loud, disastrous union. And my son, I had not spoken to my son outside of the necessary and brutally formal channels of business. I sat at my desk, but I was not looking at the city. I was looking at a small, high-definition monitor that was connected to a live feed of the main dispatch warehouse. I had it installed a week after he started. It was not an act of spying, it was an act of observation. I was a scientist studying a strange new specimen, a specimen that happened to have my own blood running through its veins. I watched him. He was not the man who had walked into my office begging for forgiveness. He was not the man who had sat at the far end of that long, polished table, a ghost in an expensive suit. The man on the screen was a stranger. He wore a simple dark blue polo shirt with the Vance Logistics logo on it, a pair of work trousers and steel-toed boots. His hair was shorter. The soft, privileged look was gone from his face, replaced by a lean, weary competence. He was not sitting in an office. He was on the floor, a clipboard in his hand, talking to a forklift driver. He was pointing at a pallet of shrink-wrapped boxes, then at a shipping manifest, his expression a mask of pure, focused concentration. For the first few weeks, I had expected him to break. I had expected a call, a resignation, an angry outburst. I had expected him to fail. The warehouse floor is a hard, unforgiving world. It is a world of deadlines, of union rules, of men who have no patience for the soft-handed theories of a business school graduate. It is Frank's world. And Frank, my shift supervisor of 30 years, was a man who had been forged in that fire. He did not suffer fools, but the call never came. There were no complaints. There were no excuses. There were only Frank's weekly reports, which Diane placed on my desk every Friday afternoon. They were brutally simple and in their own way beautiful. Marcus Vance arrived 5:58 a.m., left 6:15 p.m., did his job. Week after week, the same report. He was not just showing up, he was working. I watched him on the screen. He finished his conversation with the forklift driver and made a note on his clipboard. He walked over to the main scheduling board, his stride no longer the easy, arrogant glide of an executive, but the purposeful, slightly weary walk of a man who has been on his feet for 10 hours. There was no trace of the entitled man-child who had let his wife relegate his own father to a table by the kitchen. He was a man who had been stripped of his crown, and was now for the first time learning the weight of the hammer and the nail. A flicker of something I had not allowed myself to feel, a dangerous, fragile thing stirred in my chest. It was hope. But it was a cautious, wary hope, the hope of a farmer who has seen too many droughts to trust a single morning's dew. Was this real? Or was this just a performance? A long, humiliating, and deeply calculated act designed to win back his place, to regain his inheritance. The test had come last week. A major shipment for our biggest tech client, a shipment worth millions, had been held up by a customs snafu in the port of Savannah. It was a potential catastrophe, the kind of failure that could cost us a contract. The old Marcus would have panicked. He would have thrown money at the problem, made 1,000 frantic, useless phone calls, and then ultimately he would have called me to fix it. But the old Marcus was gone. Diane had laid out the report for me. Marcus had not panicked. He had worked the problem. He had gotten on the phone not with the client to make excuses, but with the port supervisor in Savannah. He had stayed on the line for 3 hours, tracking the container, identifying the bureaucratic holdup. When he found out the delay was indefinite, he hadn't given up. He had found an alternate carrier. He had personally supervised a team working through the night to offload the critical components, reroute them to a truck, and get them to the client's assembly plant in South Carolina, bypassing the port entirely. The shipment had arrived 2 hours ahead of schedule. The client never even knew there was a problem. That night, I was in my office late, going over the final reports. The building was quiet, the city a glittering tapestry of lights outside my window. I heard a soft knock on my open door. It was Marcus. He stood there in his simple work clothes, looking tired and older and more like a man than I had ever seen him. He held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He walked in, placed one on my desk without a word, and then stood by the window looking out at the city. "Working late, sir," he said. It was not a question. The "sir" was new. It was a quiet, formal acknowledgement of the new order. "The work doesn't do itself, son," I said, my own voice a little rough. I picked up the mug. It was black, no sugar, the way I had always taken it, the way my own father had taken it. He had remembered. It was not a peace treaty. It was not a return to the way things were, but it was a beginning. It was the laying of a single new and hopefully much stronger foundation. The city outside my window had become a river of light, a silent, glittering testament to a world that never slept. It was late. The rest of the tower was dark and quiet, the daytime hum of ambition and commerce having long since faded into the silence of the night. But I was not tired. I was a man who had spent his entire life working, and work was the one place I still felt whole. I sat at my desk, the glow of the monitor casting a cool blue light on the pages of a quarterly logistics report. It was the unglamorous, foundational work of my empire, the part that Chloe had never understood and Marcus had never cared to learn. A soft, hesitant knock on my open office door made me look up, and I was surprised to see him standing there. It was Marcus. He was not in a suit. He was in the simple dark blue uniform of a warehouse worker, the Vance Logistics logo, a small, humble badge on his breast. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes and a weariness in his posture that had nothing to do with a late night of fine dining and everything to do with a 12-hour shift of hard physical labor. He held two simple ceramic mugs, steam rising from them in the cool, still air of the office. He didn't speak. He just walked in his steel-toed boots, making a soft, unfamiliar scuffing sound on my expensive Persian rug. He walked to my desk and placed one of the mugs down on a coaster, a gesture of quiet and unexpected consideration. Then he walked over to the vast window and stood there, his back to me, looking out at the river of light below. "Working late, sir," he said. His voice was quiet and a little rough with fatigue. The "sir" was still there. It was no longer a sign of his defeat, but a quiet, constant acknowledgement of a boundary that he himself was now helping to build. "The work doesn't do itself, son," I said, my own voice a little rougher than I intended. My eyes fell to the mug on my desk. I picked it up. The warmth of it seeped into my hands. I took a sip, and I almost dropped the cup. It was coffee, and it was perfect. Black, strong, no sugar, the way I had taken it every day for 50 years. The way my own father had taken it. He had remembered, or more likely he had made it his business to learn. And in that moment, the sterile high-rise office disappeared, and I was transported back in time 50 years ago. I was not in a tower of glass and steel. I was in a small, greasy garage, the air thick with the smell of oil and old iron. I was 25 years old, and my father and I were working late into the night trying to rebuild the engine of my first beat-up cargo van. My hands were raw, my back was aching, and my hope was beginning to fail. My father, a man of few words and infinite patience, had not said a thing. He had just kept working his gnarled, beautiful hands, moving with a wisdom that I could only dream of. I remember I had gone inside and made a pot of coffee, and I had brought a mug out to him, black, no sugar, just the way he liked it. I had handed it to him, and he had taken it without a word, taken a long, slow sip, and then he had looked at me. He hadn't smiled. He had just nodded, a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of thanks. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. A silent message that said, "I see you. You are here with me. We are in this together." There was a scheduling conflict with the outbound freight to the West Coast. Marcus said, his voice pulling me back to the present. "Frank and I got it sorted out. The shipment will still arrive on time." "Good," I said, my voice thick. "That's good work." He just nodded, his reflection, a dark, quiet silhouette against the glittering backdrop of the city. He stood there for another moment in a silence that was no longer awkward, but was simply quiet. Then he turned. "Good night, sir," he said. And he walked out, leaving his own untouched mug of coffee on the credenza by the door. I was alone again in the quiet of my office. I looked at the coffee in my hand. It was more than just a hot drink. It was a message. It was a quiet, humble, and deeply profound acknowledgement. It was a gesture of respect, a gesture he had never been taught, but that he had in the crucible of his own humiliation somehow learned. It was not forgiveness. It was not a return to the easy, foolish love of the past, but it was a foundation, a small, sturdy, and for the first time in a very long time, an honest one. And it was a start. The quiet in the Vance Tower was a different kind of quiet now. It was not the tense, waiting silence of a coming storm, nor the heavy, grief-stricken silence of its aftermath. It was the quiet of reconstruction, the quiet of a foundation being reset, of a new structure being planned. The storm had passed, and the necessary brutal work of clearing the wreckage was done. Now it was time to build again. I sat in my office, the city of Atlanta, a glittering, silent tapestry beyond the glass. On my desk lay a single closed file. It was a thin file, but it was the heaviest thing in the room. The cover read, Al Jamil Port Logistics Proposal, the ghost of a $50 million future, the tombstone of my son's career. For days it had been a symbol of failure, of loss of a future that had been carelessly, stupidly thrown away. But I was a builder. I had spent my life looking at empty lots and seeing skyscrapers. I had spent my life looking at wreckage and seeing opportunity. And as I looked at that file, I no longer saw a loss. I saw a liberation. That money, that contract had been earmarked for Marcus. It was meant to be the final crowning jewel in the easy, gilded life I had so foolishly tried to build for him. It was a gift he had not earned and a responsibility he had proven himself unworthy of. And now that money, that opportunity was free. It was no longer tied to a single undeserving heir. It was a powerful, untethered resource, and it was mine to command. My mind drifted back half a century ago to a different kind of office, a small, stuffy room in a bank downtown. I was 25 years old, my heart full of a fire that I thought could burn down the world. I had a single beat-up cargo van and a business plan that I knew in my bones was brilliant. I sat across from a man, a polite, smiling white banker who had looked at my plan, looked at my hopeful young black face, and had shaken his head with a look of profound and deeply insulting pity. "It's a fine idea, Elias," he had told me, his voice as smooth as silk, "but this is a relationship business, and you just don't have the right relationships." The right relationships. I had never forgotten those words. He was telling me that the door was locked and that I did not have the key. He was telling me that my dream was invalid because the color of my skin was wrong. I had walked out of that bank, the shame and the anger, a fire in my gut, and I had sworn that I would build my own door, that I would make my own key. And I had. But now, 50 years later, I knew that there were still countless other young men and women out there, young black entrepreneurs with fire in their eyes and brilliant plans in their hands, who were walking into those same offices and hearing those same polite, soul-crushing words. They were being told they didn't have the right relationships. I picked up the phone on my desk. I did not hesitate. The idea when it came was so clear, so right, so perfect, that it felt as if it had been waiting for me my whole life. I pressed the button for Diane's line. "Yes, Elias," she said. "Diane." I said, my voice quiet but full of a new and powerful energy. "I want you to call Eleanor in legal. I want you to call our CFO. I want you to start the process of creating a new independent foundation, a charitable trust funded by the company." "Understood," she said, her voice betraying no surprise. "And the purpose of this foundation," I looked at the picture of my wife, my Rose, that sat on my desk, her beautiful, intelligent eyes full of a strength that had been the true foundation of this entire company. "Its purpose," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I did not try to hide, "will be to provide seed capital and mentorship for young African-American entrepreneurs in the event and logistics industry. We will find the young ones, Diane, the ones with fire in their eyes and a good idea who are being told no for all the wrong reasons. And we," I said, "are going to tell them yes. We are going to be their right relationship." "And the name of the foundation, Elias?" she asked softly. I looked at the picture of my wife again. "The Rose Vance Heritage Fund," I said. "It was not a legacy for one son. It was a legacy for 1,000 sons and 1,000 daughters. It was a new beginning." The autumn months gave way to the first sharp chill of winter. The city of Atlanta, seen from the windows of my office, was a study in gray and steel, a world of hard lines and cold, clear light. It was a landscape that mirrored the new reality of my relationship with my son. The furious emotional storm of the wedding had passed, leaving behind a quiet and deeply cold peace. Our interactions were brief, formal, and conducted entirely within the rigid hierarchy of the company. When he saw me in the hallways, he would nod. "Sir," he would say, his eyes focused on a point somewhere over my shoulder, and I would nod back. "Marcus." That was all. There were no fatherly inquiries, no sonly confessions. We were two celestial bodies that had once been a single star, now orbiting each other at a cold and respectful distance. I watched him not with the intrusive eye of a father, but with the dispassionate analytical gaze of a CEO. The live feed from the warehouse was a constant silent presence on a secondary monitor on my desk. I watched him learn the names of the drivers. I watched him argue with Frank, the warehouse supervisor, over a shipping manifest. And then I watched him a few minutes later admit that Frank was right. I watched him stay late long after the other office staff had gone home, a solitary figure under the harsh fluorescent lights trying to untangle a logistical knot that the old Marcus would have simply delegated or ignored. Diane, my loyal and unsentimental second-in-command, was the bridge between my world and his. Her weekly reports were my only real insight into his progress. They were brutally and beautifully honest. "He's slow," she had told me after the first month. "He thinks too much like an executive, but he's not stupid, and he listens." From a woman like Diane, that was the highest of compliments. The father in me, a persistent and foolish old ghost, wanted to reach out. He wanted to tell his son that he was proud. He wanted to close the vast, cold distance between the top floor and the warehouse floor. But the CEO, the man who had been forced to perform this brutal surgery, knew that the wound was still too fresh. The change in Marcus was real, I could see that. But was it permanent? Was it a true transformation of character, or was it just a long, desperate performance, an act of penance designed to win back his inheritance? I did not know. And until I did, the distance had to remain. One afternoon in December, I did something I had not done in years. I left my office, and I took the elevator not down to the lobby, but down to the vast, echoing cavern of the main dispatch warehouse. The air down there was a different world, thick with the smell of diesel and cardboard and the cold metallic scent of industry. It was a world of noise, of the roar of trucks, the screech of forklifts, the loud, easy laughter of working men. It was the world I had come from, and it was the world my son now inhabited. I found him on the loading dock, a clipboard in his hand, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cold. He was in a heated but professional discussion with a driver about weight distribution on a long-haul truck. He didn't see me at first, and I just stood and I watched. He was not the boy I had raised. He was not the executive I had created. He was a man I did not know, a man who was comfortable in this world of noise and hard edges, a man who was earning his place. He finally saw me, and a flicker of the old panicked guilt crossed his face before he suppressed it. He straightened up. "Sir," he said, his voice respectful, "is there a problem?" I shook my head. "No problem, Marcus," I said. "Just inspecting the engine room." I looked past him at the organized chaos of the loading dock. That new contract with the pharmaceutical company. I said, "Their supply chain is a nightmare." I was looking at the projections. "I don't see how we can guarantee their cold chain integrity without a 50% failure rate." The old Marcus would have given me a vague business school answer about mitigating risk and leveraging assets. But the man standing before me just nodded his eyes, focused his mind, already working the problem. "I know, sir," he said. "I've been looking at it too. The projections are based on the old routing software. It doesn't account for the new traffic patterns on the interstate. If we reroute the shipments through the secondary hub in Chattanooga and use a dedicated team of drivers who are certified for refrigerated transport, we can cut the transit time by 6 hours. The failure rate drops to less than 1%. I just stared at him. It was a brilliant, practical, and deeply informed solution. It was a solution that could only have come from a man who understood the business not from a spreadsheet, but from the concrete of the warehouse floor. It was the answer of a true logistician. It was the answer of a Vance. I did not smile. I did not praise him. I just gave him a single, slow, deliberate nod. The same nod my own father had given me in a greasy garage 50 years ago. A nod that said, "I see you. You are here with me. We are in this together." "Good," I said. "Draft a proposal. Have it on my desk by the end of the day." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there on the loading dock. The relationship was not fixed. The wounds were not healed. The future was not written. But as I walked back towards the elevator, back towards the silent, lonely kingdom on the top floor, I knew for the first time in a very long time that the foundation was no longer broken. It was just new, and it was a start. I built an empire for my son, but I forgot to teach him its most important lesson: respect is the only currency that never loses its value. At his wedding, I was dismissed as a relic of the past, so I quietly reminded him that the past was the very foundation he stood upon. By canceling the party, I was not being cruel. I was presenting a bill for a lifetime of sacrifice and love. True wealth isn't the legacy you leave for your children, but the character you build within them. Now I have a question for you. What do you believe is the most important lesson a parent can pass on to their child? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that character is more valuable than cash, show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing so these stories can continue to be told. Thank you for listening.